"You're holding her back." My wife's friends laughed while demanding my divorce. Then I revealed the secret folder that sent them all into foreclosure. My wife and her friends ambushed me on a FaceTime call from a wine bar, laughing as they demanded I give her a divorce because I was holding her back. So, I smiled into the camera, pulled out my secret folder, and asked her friends if they were aware my wife had been sleeping with their husbands for the past year. It all started about 8 months ago. I'm Mark, a 3-4-year-old construction project manager, and I had been married to Elena, 32, for 7 years. Elena was a high-powered HR director at a mid-sized logistics firm. Over the last year, our marriage had grown incredibly cold. The house felt like a museum when she was around, quiet, sterile, and devoid of any warmth. She was constantly working late, taking spontaneous weekend corporate retreats, and spending whatever free time she had with her elite clique of friends. Her inner circle consisted of Sarah, a severe woman who always looked like she was judging your life choices, Chloe, a bubbly, easily manipulated follower, and Megan, a prominent local mommy blogger who documented her supposedly perfect suburban life for thousands of followers. They held court every Thursday night at the Velvet Vine, an absurdly overpriced wine bar downtown. I was just the blue-collar husband who paid the mortgage and kept the house clean while Elena lived her best life. I wasn't an idiot. I noticed the signs. The sudden change in her wardrobe, the obsessive phone guarding, the credit card statements showing charges at high-end steakhouses when she claimed to be working through lunch at her desk. But the real smoking gun came when she upgraded her iPhone and carelessly left the old one synced to our shared iCloud account. One night, while trying to find an old tax document, I stumbled upon a hidden album. What I found didn't just break my heart, it shattered my entire reality. Elena wasn't just having an affair, she was a predator. She was collecting married men like trophies. I found hundreds of photos, hotel receipts, and explicit text screenshots. But the most sickening part? Her favorite targets were the husbands of her best friends. There were photos of Elena making out with Sarah's husband, Tom, in his Audi. There were videos of her with Chloe's husband, Marcus, at the Starlight Inn out on Route 47. She was systematically sleeping her way through her own friend group, destroying their marriages behind their backs while smiling to their faces. I spent weeks building a massive physical and digital folder. I hired a private investigator named Vince to gather airtight proof. I was planning to confront her privately, hand her the divorce papers, and walk away with my dignity. But Elena didn't want a quiet exit. She wanted a show. The notification chimed on my phone at exactly 9:47 p.m., on a Thursday. A FaceTime call from Elena. I accepted it, settling back into my living room recliner. The screen connected, and I was immediately hit with the deafening background noise of the Velvet Vine and the sound of cackling laughter. Elena's face filled the screen, flushed from expensive Pinot Noir, her dark hair perfectly styled. Behind her, crowded around a high-top table, were Sarah, Chloe, and Megan. "Having fun, ladies?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly even. "Oh, we're having a blast," Sarah chimed in, leaning into the frame. Her smile was predatory, like a shark circling a wounded seal. "Actually, Mark, we've been talking about you." My stomach tightened, but my face remained a mask of polite curiosity. "All good things, I hope?" Chloe popped into view, her cheeks bright red from alcohol. "Well, that depends on your perspective," she giggled uncontrollably. Megan was holding her phone up in the background, clearly recording the entire interaction for her private archives, or worse, her blog. "Mark, we've been doing some serious girl talk tonight," Elena announced. Her voice shifted into the cold, corporate tone she used when terminating employees. "And we've reached a unanimous decision, it's time for us to get a divorce." The sheer audacity of it hit me like a physical blow. I knew the marriage was over, but I never expected this theater. I never expected her to turn the destruction of our life into a spectator sport for her friends. They were all grinning at me through the screen, waiting for the punchline of their cruel joke to land. "We've decided," Sarah repeated, emphasizing the we. "Elena deserves so much better than what she's getting at home." "You're holding her back, Mark," Chloe added, nodding sagely like a philosopher dispensing ancient wisdom. "She needs to spread her wings." I sat in absolute silence for a full 10 seconds. I let the awkwardness stretch. I watched their smug grins falter just a fraction as they realized I wasn't crying. I wasn't begging. I wasn't giving them the emotional breakdown they so desperately wanted to witness. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "So," I said quietly, my voice cutting through the bar noise, "none of you care that she's been sleeping with your husbands?" The laughter died instantly. It was as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire table. 4 faces stared at me through the screen, their expressions violently shifting from smug satisfaction to absolute, paralyzing confusion. "What did you just say?" Sarah's voice was sharp, all pretense of tipsy friendliness completely evaporated. "You heard me," I said, standing up and walking closer to the camera so my face filled their screens. "Elena, should I tell them about Tom and Marcus?" Or should we start with the iCloud photos from the Starlight Inn? Elena's face went chalk white. The wine glass in her hand trembled visibly. Mark, you're being ridiculous. You're just trying to. Am I? I interrupted, my voice turning to ice. Sarah, when was the last time you checked the GPS history in Tom's Audi? Chloe, does Marcus still claim he's working late at the accounting firm on Tuesdays and Fridays? Because I have the receipts that say otherwise. The silence on their end was deafening. I could see Sarah and Chloe slowly turning their heads to look at Elena, doubt and terror creeping into their eyes. Nice try, Mark. Megan finally said, though her voice wavered. You're just trying to deflect because you're a failure of a husband. I smiled for the first time that evening. A genuine, terrifying smile. Well, I guess we'll find out soon enough. Enjoy the rest of your girls' night, Lenaze. Something tells me it's going to be your last one together. I ended the call. My hands were shaking, not from sadness, but from a massive surge of adrenaline. For months, I had felt like a victim. Tonight, I felt like a god. If Elena wanted a public divorce, I would give her a nuclear one. I walked into my home office, opened my laptop, and began executing the contingency plan I had spent weeks preparing. The first email went to Jake, my best friend and the owner of the local Iron Core gym. Jake was fiercely loyal, and more importantly, he controlled the morning gossip network of our entire town. I attached 3 highly incriminating photos of Elena with Tom and Marcus. The second email went to Mrs. Higgins, our 70-year-old neighbor who ran the homeowners association like a military dictatorship. She knew everyone, talked to everyone, and had been dropping subtle hints about the strange cars in my driveway for weeks. The third email went to Vince, my private investigator. I told him the timeline had moved up. It was time to unleash everything. I packed 2 bags of Elena's clothes, set them on the front porch, changed the code on the smart lock, and went to sleep. Update 1. The next morning, the town practically caught fire. I met Jake in the gym parking lot at 5 a.m. He was holding 2 black coffees, looking at me like I was a ghost. Tell me this is a prank, Mark, Jake said, holding up his phone to show the email I'd sent. I wish it was, I replied, taking the coffee. Look at the timestamps. Last Tuesday. The same night Sarah posted that long Facebook tribute about how lucky she is to have a loyal husband like Tom. Jake's jaw tightened so hard I thought his teeth would crack. Tom and Marcus are in the 6 a.m. lifting group. They'll be here in an hour. Good, I said. Let the boys know exactly what kind of men they're spotting. By 7 a.m., half the town knew. Jake didn't just whisper, he practically broadcasted it. When Tom walked into the gym, 3 different guys refused to acknowledge him. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a chainsaw. I left the gym and drove to my construction site. I oversee a massive residential development, managing about 50 blue-collar guys who value loyalty above oxygen. I gathered my foreman for the morning briefing. I didn't give them the explicit details, just the facts. My wife demanded a divorce on camera with her friends, and I found out she'd been running through the neighborhood husbands. You're kidding me, said Mike, my lead electrician. With Tom and Marcus, those pretentious suits? Yep, I said, unrolling the blueprints. So if my phone is blowing up today, that's why. In a town like ours, news travels at the speed of light. These guys had wives who were in book clubs with Sarah, PTA meetings with Chloe, and followed Megan's mommy blog. The wildfire was out of control by 10 a.m. At noon, I met Vince, the PI, at a rundown diner on the edge of the county line. Vince was a retired cop with a permanent scowl, and a talent for digital excavation. He slid a thick, heavy manila folder across the sticky table. You blew the lid off early, Vince grunted, sipping black coffee. But I got the rest of it. Your wife isn't just a cheater, Mark, she's a liability. I opened the folder. It wasn't just photos of her with Tom and Marcus anymore. What is this? I asked, looking at stacks of internal corporate emails. She has a type, Vince explained. She likes power. She's been having affairs with 2 of her direct subordinates at the logistics firm. Men who rely on her for their bonuses and promotions. It's textbook sexual harassment and abuse of power. I found the burner email account she uses to communicate with them. I felt physically sick. My wife was a monster. And there's more. Vince tapped a financial ledger. She's been siphoning money from your joint savings into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands for over a year. About $85,000 in total. She was planning to drain you completely before she filed. I stared at the numbers. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously planned, that the last remaining shred of love I had for her instantly evaporated, replaced by cold, calculating rage. My phone vibrated violently against the table. It was a text from Jake. Sarah just showed up at the gym looking for you. She is screaming in the parking lot. Tom is locked in his car refusing to come out. I paid Vince, took the folder, and drove straight to Elena's corporate office. The receptionist looked terrified when I walked in. Mr. Davis, Elena left strict instructions that she isn't seeing visitors. I'm her husband, I said smoothly, walking past the desk. And this is a family emergency. I pushed open the heavy glass door to Elena's corner office. She was frantically pacing behind her desk, looking like she hadn't slept a single second. When she saw me, her eyes darted to the blinds, making sure they were closed. "What the hell did you do?" she hissed, her voice trembling with raw panic. "Sarah and Chloe have been calling me nonstop. Marcus packed a bag and left Chloe this morning." "You ruined my life." "I didn't ruin anything," I said, dropping the massive manila folder onto her pristine glass desk. The thud echoed in the silent room. "I just turned on the lights. You're the one who let the roaches in." I opened the folder and spread the documents out like a deck of cards. The photos with Tom, the motel receipts with Marcus, the bank statements showing the $85,000 she stole from our joint account, and finally, the internal emails with her subordinates. Elena stopped breathing. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers as she stared at the HR nightmare laid out before her. "If your firm's board of directors sees these emails, Elena, you won't just be fired. You'll be blacklisted from the industry. You might even face a civil lawsuit for workplace harassment. And as for the $85,000 you embezzled from our family, that's fraud." She sank into her expensive ergonomic chair, her arrogant facade completely collapsing. She looked small, pathetic, and utterly terrified. "What do you want?" she whispered, tears finally spilling over her mascara. "I want the house. I want the $85,000 wired back to my personal account by 5 p.m. today. I want you to sign the uncontested divorce papers my lawyer is drafting right now. You will take nothing but your clothes and your car. If you fight me on a single dime, this folder goes to the CEO of your company, and then I hand it over to the police." "Mark, please," she sobbed, reaching out for my hand. I was just confused. The spark was gone. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I pulled my hand back like she was radioactive. "You didn't mean to trip and fall onto your best friend's husbands? You didn't mean to accidentally wire 85 grand to the Caymans? Save the performance, Elena. You have until 5 p.m. I turned and walked out of the office, leaving her sobbing in the ruins of the life she destroyed. Update 2. When I got home that evening, there was a black SUV parked in my driveway. Sarah and Chloe were standing on my front porch. They looked like they had aged a decade in 24 hours. Sarah's usually immaculate hair was a mess, and Chloe's eyes were swollen shut from crying. I walked up the driveway, keys in hand, projecting absolute calm. "Mark," Sarah choked out, her voice cracking. "Please, we need to talk to you." I unlocked the door and left it open for them to follow. They practically collapsed onto my living room sofa, the very same sofa where I had sat the night they tried to humiliate me. "Are you happy now?" Sarah snapped, a brief flash of her old venom returning. Tom confessed, he admitted to everything. "My kids are crying upstairs because their father is sleeping at a Motel 6. You blew up our families." "I didn't blow up anything, Sarah," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Tom and Elena planted the bomb. I just showed you the timer. But you didn't have to do it like this." Chloe wailed, burying her face in her hands. "Marcus told me he wants a divorce. He says he's in love with Elena. Why didn't you just come to us privately? Why did you have to tell the whole town?" I stared at them, letting the sheer hypocrisy of their words wash over me. "Privately?" I laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Like how you came to me privately? Like how you cornered me on a video call in a crowded bar to demand I divorce my wife because I was holding her back." They both flinched, looking away in deep shame. "You wanted to play God with my marriage," I continued, my voice dangerously low. "You wanted to sit on your high horses and judge me while your husbands were tearing my life apart. You enabled her. You cheered her on. You thought it was an entertaining little drama for your wine nights. Well, now the drama is in your living rooms. Enjoy the show." "We didn't know," Sarah pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I swear to God, Mark, we didn't know she was sleeping with them." "You didn't times want times to know," I corrected her. "You saw the signs. You knew Tom was unaccounted for. You knew Marcus was lying, but it was easier to blame me for Elena's misery than to look at your own broken marriages." I walked over to the front door and opened it wider. "Get out of my house, and next time you decide to stage an intervention, make sure your own backyard isn't a toxic waste dump." They left in silence, the weight of their shattered realities crushing them. The next few days were a blur of legal paperwork and financial transactions. Terrified of the corporate and legal fallout, Elena wired the $85,000 back into my account within hours. She signed the uncontested divorce papers without a single argument. She moved into a cheap extended stay hotel on the outskirts of town. But the story didn't end there. Because Vince, my private investigator, called me a week later with one final, mind-bending discovery. "Mark, you need to come to my office," Vince said over the phone. I traced the original anonymous email that tipped me off to look into the Starlight Inn. I frowned. "What anonymous email? I hired you because I found the iCloud folder." "Before that," Vince said. 2 months ago, I got an anonymous tip on my business site suggesting I look into Elena Davis and Tom. I ignored it because no one was paying me, until you hired me. I just ran a deep IP trace on that old tip. When I got to Vince's office, he turned his monitor around. The IP address and the burner email were registered to a local coffee shop's public Wi-Fi, but the MAC address of the device matched a laptop registered to Megan. Megan, the mommy blogger. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. Megan knew. She knew about Elena and Tom. She knew about Elena and Marcus. But instead of telling her friends, she decided to orchestrate an anonymous implosion. I drove straight to Megan's house. Her husband, Dave, answered the door. He was the only innocent husband in this entire mess, a quiet guy who worked in IT. Mark? Dave looked incredibly uncomfortable. Listen, man, I'm so sorry about everything that's happening. Is Megan here? I asked politely. Megan appeared behind him, holding a toddler on her hip. When she saw me, the color drained from her face. Dave, can you take the baby to the playroom? I asked. Megan and I need to chat about her blog. Dave looked confused but complied, leaving us alone in the foyer. What do you want, Mark? Megan whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. I know it was you, I said softly. I know you sent the anonymous tip to the PI 2 months ago. You knew Elena was sleeping with Tom and Marcus. Megan backed up against the wall, her breathing turning shallow. I don't know what you're talking about. Vince traced the MAC address. Megan, don't insult my intelligence. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. Why didn't you just tell Sarah and Chloe? Why send an anonymous tip to a PI? Megan swallowed hard, tears of pure panic welling in her eyes. You don't understand, my blog. The engagement was dying. The sponsorships were drying up. I got a literary agent who said I needed a compelling narrative for a book deal. Something dark. Suburban secrets. I needed the friend group to implode naturally so I could document the fallout anonymously. I needed the drama. 5. Last. 5. Knife. 5. I stared at her, utterly repulsed. Elena was a predator, but Megan was a parasite. She was willing to sacrifice the marriages of her 2 best friends, just to get material for a book deal. You're sick, I said. Please, Mark, she begged, grabbing my arm. Don't tell Dave. Don't tell Sarah or Chloe. They've lost enough. If they know I knew, they'll destroy me. I'll lose everything. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back up to her desperate, pleading eyes. You sat at that wine bar, I said, my voice eerily calm. You recorded me being humiliated. You called me a failure of a husband, knowing exactly what my wife was doing to your friends. You wanted content, Megan? I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I had already dialed Sarah, Chloe, and Dave on a merged group call the moment Dave walked away. The call had been connected the entire time. Well, I said, holding the phone up so she could see the active call screen. Here's your final chapter. I hit end call, turned around, and walked out of her house. Before I even reached my truck, I heard the sound of Dave screaming from inside. Top comments. User 1. This is the most satisfying scorched earth revenge I have ever read. The fact that the blogger friend was orchestrating the whole thing for a book deal is actual supervillain behavior. You handled this like an absolute king. Enjoy your house and your $85K. User 2. The absolute audacity of them FaceTiming you to demand a divorce while 2 of them are literally getting cheated on by the same woman. The lack of self-awareness is staggering. Good on you for not warning them. They made their bed, now they can sleep in it, alone. User 3. I didn't blow up anything. Tom and Elena planted the bomb. I just showed you the timer. That is the coldest, hardest line I have ever heard in my life. I hope you are healing. Mark. You dodged a massive, sociopathic bullet. My parents ignored my existence to worship my golden brother. When his career tanked, they tried to hijack my success. My response ruined them. My father stood up at my 26th birthday dinner, delivered a tear-jerking, 10-minute speech about my twin brother's achievements, and then turned to me, raised his glass, and muttered exactly 7 words. And happy birthday to you, too, Caleb. I walked out of the restaurant that night, cut my family off, and quietly built a massive $500,000 company, only to watch my father's secret financial ruin bring him crawling to my doorstep a year later begging for a bailout. Original post. For our 26th birthday, my twin brother got a customized toast, a deeply emotional speech, and a private dining room full of tears and applause. When the clapping finally died down, my dad cleared his throat, looked in my general direction, and said, "And happy birthday to you, too, Caleb." Everyone immediately went back to eating their expensive steaks. I sat there in the stifling noise of clinking silverware for exactly 10 more minutes. Then, I quietly pushed my chair back, took my fiance's hand, and walked out of my family's life. My name is Caleb. I am 26 years old, and I want to tell you about the excruciating night I finally realized I had been cast as a silent background character in the movie of my own family's life. I don't mean that in some poetic, metaphorical sense, I mean it quite literally. My father looked me dead in the eye at a party that was supposedly for both of us, gave me 7 obligatory words, and then turned back to his meal like I was an annoying commercial break he had been waiting to end. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me back up and give you the context of how a family breaks apart so quietly that nobody even hears the snap. I have a twin brother named Liam. We are fraternal twins, not identical, which I think is a crucial detail here because people always expected us to be vastly different, and we absolutely were. Liam was the loud one. He was the golden athlete, the charismatic extrovert, the kind of guy who could walk into a crowded room and immediately have 6 people laughing hysterically at a joke he just made up. He played varsity baseball and football in high school, was crowned homecoming king, and had the kind of perfect, symmetrical jawline that made the old ladies at our church in Richmond, Virginia, constantly stop my mother to say, "Oh, Sarah, you must be bursting with pride." And she was. They both were. My parents worshipped the ground Liam walked on. Me? I was the quiet one. I liked reading thick historical biographies. I liked the smell of sawdust and building intricate things with my hands. I spent the vast majority of my high school years tucked away in the dusty woodshop or isolated in my bedroom, meticulously sketching out complex furniture designs on graph paper. I wasn't some antisocial outcast or a weird recluse. I had a solid group of friends, I went to normal teenage parties, and I had a lovely girlfriend for most of my junior year. I just wasn't Liam. And in my family's household, not being Liam was apparently an unforgivable deal breaker. We grew up in a very affluent, manicured suburb just outside of Richmond. Our dad, Tom, was a high-rolling partner at a commercial real estate firm. Our mom, Sarah, was a cosmetic dental hygienist who treated neighborhood gossip like a competitive sport. We had a sprawling house, a massive backyard with a pool, and a golden retriever named Buster, who was, without a shadow of a doubt, the only objectively good member of our family because Buster loved everyone equally. Buster was the only one who didn't keep score. I should make one thing incredibly clear. Liam and I actually got along fine when we were growing up. We weren't those magical, telepathic twins who finished each other's sentences, but we shared a bedroom until we were 13, played the exact same video games, and bickered over whose turn it was to walk Buster in the freezing rain. Liam wasn't actively malicious or mean to me. He wasn't even consciously aware of the massive psychological disparity happening under our roof. There is a very distinct difference between a villain who actively hurts you and a person who blindly benefits from a rigged system they didn't personally build. Liam was the latter. At least, he was back then. The blatant favoritism wasn't always a screaming siren when we were little kids. It was a slow, insidious drip. It was subtle, plausible deniability. It was the way my dad would charge his camcorder battery to film every single agonizing second of Liam's baseball tournaments, but completely forget to show up to my state-level woodworking showcase at school. It was the specific way my mom would introduce us at large family gatherings. She would firmly wrap her arm around Liam's broad shoulders, beam with radiant joy, and say, "This is Liam, our absolute superstar. He just got scouted for a Division I scholarship." Then, she would vaguely gesture in my direction with a dismissive nod and add, "And this is Caleb, period, end of sentence." No accolades, no context, no pride, just my name and the heavy, unspoken implication that I was merely the leftover spare. For years, I lied to myself. I convinced myself that it didn't bother me. I built up this impenetrable internal narrative where I was the mature, stoic son. I was the independent one who didn't require constant external validation. I was above keeping score. Spoiler alert, I was absolutely keeping score, carving tally marks into the walls of my own mind. I just didn't have anyone who cared enough to look at the scoreboard. When we graduated high school, Liam secured a partial athletic scholarship to play baseball at a decent university in Atlanta. It was treated like a royal coronation. My parents threw a massive, catered celebration in our backyard. My grandparents flew in from out of state. My dad actually cried real, trembling, cinematic tears over a scholarship that barely covered 40% of the tuition. Meanwhile, I got accepted into a highly prestigious, fiercely competitive trade program for master furniture making and advanced woodcraft in Charlottesville, Virginia. It was a small, elite cohort offering hands-on apprenticeships with master artisans. When I nervously presented my acceptance letter at the dinner table, my mom briefly glanced at it and sighed, "Oh, that's nice, honey. But will you eventually get a real college degree, too?" My dad simply asked how much the tools would cost before immediately changing the subject to Liam's upcoming freshman orientation schedule. That interaction became the permanent blueprint for our entire adult lives. Liam breathes, the family throws a parade. Caleb achieves a milestone, the family politely shrugs. Liam graduated college with a generic communications degree, massive blowout party at a country club. I finished my elite artisan program, secured my own workshop space, and started getting high-paying commissions for custom hardwood furniture. My mom asked if I had considered applying for a stable management job at Home Depot. Liam got engaged to his incredibly sweet, bubbly girlfriend, Paige. My parents hosted a lavish, 5-course engagement dinner downtown. I started dating a brilliant, fiercely independent woman named Maya who I met at a local arts festival in Charlottesville, and my parents didn't even bother to meet her for almost 14 months, because they simply never asked a single question about my personal life. Maya noticed the toxic dynamic before I was ever willing to verbalize it. She would occasionally accompany me to the rare family dinners in Richmond and just sit there in stunned silence, watching my parents orbit around Liam like he was the literal blazing sun. She watched my dad aggressively interrogate Liam about his corporate job, his fantasy football brackets, his golf swing, and his weekend drinking plans, and then never once pivot to ask me a single question about my life. After one particularly agonizing Thanksgiving, Maya looked at me in the dark cabin of my truck on the drive back to Charlottesville and softly asked, "Caleb, does your family even know you exist?" I tried to laugh it off, but the question landed in the center of my chest like a block of lead. By the time our 26th birthday rolled around, I had quietly built a very solid, incredibly fulfilling life for myself. I had a small but rapidly expanding custom furniture business. I was handcrafting massive dining tables, complex bookshelves, and intricate bed frames, heirloom pieces that wealthy clients were paying serious money to own. I had just been featured in a regional architectural design magazine. Maya and I had been together for 3 years, and we had just moved into a beautiful craftsman house we were renting with an ironclad option to buy. I was happy. I was stubbornly, quietly happy, like a stubborn weed that had learned to bloom in completely barren soil despite nobody ever bothering to water it. Our parents aggressively insisted on throwing a joint birthday dinner. Turning 26 felt like a milestone, my mom claimed. They booked the private back room at a very expensive, dimly lit steakhouse in Richmond and invited about 35 people. It was a mix of extended family, my parents' country club friends, Liam's rowdy college buddies, and Paige's wealthy parents. The invitation read, "Come celebrate Liam and Caleb's 26th birthday. Equal billing, at least in ink." Maya and I drove in from Charlottesville the evening before. We were forced to stay at a nearby Marriott because my parents' guest room had recently been converted into what my mother unironically called the Liam Memory Room. It was a literal, terrifying shrine to my brother's athletic glory days. Trophies lined custom shelving, framed newspaper clippings covered the walls, and his high school baseball jerseys were professionally mounted in shadow boxes. Maya took one look inside that room, didn't utter a single word, and just squeezed my hand so hard her knuckles turned white. The night of the birthday dinner, Maya and I arrived exactly on time. The private room was aggressively decorated. Silver balloons, a massive custom banner, and an enormous tiered cake with both of our names scrawled in icing. Liam was already there, holding court, shaking hands, hugging aunts, and just radiating that effortless golden retriever energy he always had. I walked in, gave my mom a stiff hug, nodded at my dad, and then strategically retreated to the shadowy edges of the room, quietly nursing a club soda and catching up with an older cousin. Dinner was finally served around 7:30 p.m. The steaks were perfectly cooked, the wine was flowing, and the ambient noise of 35 people laughing was deafening. And then, my dad stood up at the head of the long table. He dramatically clinked his crystal glass with a knife. The entire room fell into a hushed, reverent silence. I sat up a little straighter. I thought to myself, okay, here we go. We are 26 years old. This is a joint party. Surely, this will be balanced. What happened over the next 10 minutes is permanently seared into my brain, and honestly, looking back now, I am profoundly grateful that it happened because it was the brutal slap to the face that finally woke me from a 26-year coma. My dad held his glass high, a warm, glowing smile plastered across his face, the exact smile I had spent my entire miserable childhood desperately trying to earn. He immediately launched into a monologue about Liam. He talked about the terrifying day we were born, specifically focusing on how Liam came out first, screaming his lungs out, ready to conquer the world. He talked about Liam's first steps, his first words, his first home run. He recounted a wildly exaggerated story about Liam at age 8, standing up to a bully on the playground, and how my dad knew right then and there that his son was destined for greatness. He talked about Liam's college baseball career, his magnetic personality, and the way he lights up every single room he enters. He praised Paige, talking about how proud he was that Liam had secured such a wonderful future wife. He talked about Liam's new mid-level corporate job in Atlanta and how he just knew his boy was going to climb straight to the top of the executive ladder. It went on for 10 minutes. 10 full, agonizing, uninterrupted minutes of my father standing in front of 35 people, pouring his entire soul out about my twin brother. Extended family members were dabbing their eyes with linen napkins. My mom was openly weeping. Paige had her hand dramatically pressed over her heart. Liam sat there looking deeply humbled and grateful. And I sat exactly 3 seats down, staring at my half-eaten mashed potatoes, feeling a massive, invisible fault line crack open inside my chest. Everything I had been holding together with duct tape and sheer stubbornness for 26 years was splintering. When my dad finally finished his poetic masterpiece about Liam, he paused. He took a deep, theatrical breath. He turned his head slightly to the left, looked at me, and said, "And happy birthday to you, too, Caleb." He raised his glass in my general direction. A few oblivious people around the table mumbled, "Happy birthday, Caleb," in that deeply awkward, obligatory tone you use when someone suddenly reminds you there is a second person in the room. And then, my dad sat down. The conversation immediately resumed, the clinking of silverware returned. That was it, 7 words. After 600 seconds of pure, unadulterated poetry about my brother, I received 7 words in a vague gesture like I was a forgotten postscript at the bottom of a love letter addressed to someone else. I sat completely frozen for about 10 minutes. I robotically cut my steak. I moved a piece of asparagus around my plate. I took a sip of ice water. Underneath the heavy tablecloth, Maya had her hand resting firmly on my knee, her fingers digging into my leg. I could feel her burning gaze on the side of my face, but I absolutely refused to look back at her because I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I met her eyes, I would completely shatter. I could feel my throat constricting. My eyes were stinging with hot, humiliating tears, and I swore to God I was not going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break. Not here, not in front of 35 people who had just silently watched my own father verbally erase me from my own birthday. I carefully folded my linen napkin, placed it next to my plate, pushed my heavy chair back, leaned over to Maya, and whispered, "I need to leave right now." She didn't hesitate. She instantly grabbed her purse, stood up, and took my arm. Nobody even noticed us at first. We were already halfway to the heavy wooden exit doors when my aunt finally spotted us and called out, "Caleb, where are you going?" "They haven't even brought out the cake yet." I didn't stop walking. I just threw a glance over my shoulder and flatly said, "I'm not feeling well. Tell everyone goodbye." And we walked out into the cool Virginia night. The drive back to the Marriott was suffocatingly silent for the first 5 miles, I gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands were shaking. Eventually, I abruptly pulled my truck into an empty gas station parking lot, slammed the gear into park, and just sat there staring blankly at the flickering fluorescent lights of the convenience store. Maya didn't push me to speak. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She just sat quietly and waited. And then, the tidal wave hit me. The realization I had been out running for my entire life finally caught up and slammed into me. I wasn't sad anymore. I was furiously, violently angry. It wasn't a loud, explosive anger. It was a cold, quiet rage. The kind of rage that starts in the pit of your stomach and pumps ice water through your veins. 26 years of being the other one. 26 years of being a tiny footnote in my own family's history. 26 years of watching my parents pour every single ounce of love, attention, financial support, and pride into Liam while I stood 3 feet away pretending the starvation didn't hurt. And for what? Because I preferred building things in a quiet shop instead of throwing a leather ball on a grassy field? Because I wasn't a loud, boisterous spectacle? Maya finally broke the silence. Her voice was trembling with her own anger. She looked at me and said, "You do not deserve this, Caleb. You have never deserved this, and I am not going to sit here and watch you keep pretending that this is acceptable. They don't see you, and they never will." I nodded slowly. I couldn't trust my voice to speak. When we finally got back to our hotel room, my phone started vibrating relentlessly. My mom had texted first. "Where did you go? Your father is very upset. You completely embarrassed us in front of everyone by storming out early. Liam is worried about you." I stared at the screen, letting out a dark, hollow laugh. Notice the incredible framing of that text message. My father times is upset. I times embarrassed times them. Liam times is worried. Not a single word asking times why times I left. Not a single shred of self-awareness that anyone in that room understood what had just transpired. Liam texted me a few minutes later, "Hey bro, you good? Mom said you bounced. Hope you're feeling okay. Wish you could have stayed for the cake, it was red velvet." He wasn't trying to be malicious. That is the deeply tragic thing about Liam, he isn't inherently cruel. He has just been so thoroughly cemented as the center of the universe for so long that he lacks the basic capacity to perceive the gross imbalance. Asking Liam to notice the favoritism is like asking a fish to notice the water it swims in. I didn't respond to a single message. Maya and I sat on the edge of that cheap hotel bed, and for the first time in my entire adult life, I laid it all out. I talked about every single ignored milestone. I talked about the time I won first place in a prestigious regional woodworking competition at 17, and my parents completely forgot to attend because Liam had a times practice scrimmage. A practice scrimmage. Not even a real game. I told her about the time I overheard my dad telling my uncle that he was deeply concerned I lacked ambition, while I was literally standing in the garage sanding a custom coffee table I had just been paid $600 to build. Maya listened to all of it, holding my hands. Then she asked a question that fundamentally altered my brain chemistry. "Caleb, You have been waiting 26 years for them to finally see you. What if they never do? What are you going to do then? I didn't have an answer that night, but the question burrowed deep into my skull. The next morning, my mom called twice. I let it ring into the void. Then, shockingly, my dad called. My dad never called my cell phone. I watched his name flash on the screen, feeling a brief, pathetic flutter of hope that maybe, just maybe, he was calling to apologize. I let it go to voicemail. I listened to it later in the truck. The message was, "Caleb, your mother says you left because you felt sick. Hope you're better. Call us when you get a chance. Liam wants to grab brunch before you drive back." No apology, no self-awareness, just a casual dismissal. Maya and I checked out of the hotel, drove the 2 hours back to Charlottesville, and I didn't call any of them. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel a crushing wave of guilt. I felt completely, utterly done. Not in a dramatic, screaming, bridge-burning way. Done in the quiet, permanent way, the way where you finally accept that a phone works both ways, and if they wanted to reach you, they would. I decided right then and there to stop showing up to tables where no place was set for me. Update 1. The first month after the birthday disaster was bizarrely quiet. I simply stopped initiating contact. I stopped calling on Sunday afternoons. I stopped texting my mom first. I stopped being the invisible glue desperately holding my side of the relationship together. And you want to know the most pathetic part? It took them almost 4 entire weeks to notice I was gone. 28 days passed before my mom finally sent a text, "Haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" It wasn't a panicked phone call. It was a casual text, like she was checking to see if a neglected houseplant was still green. I replied, "Yep, just busy with work." She replied with a thumbs up emoji. That was the entirety of our communication for the next 3 months. During this silence, Maya gently but persistently pushed me into therapy. I started seeing a brilliant psychologist named Dr. Aris. During our very first session, I recounted the birthday dinner story. Dr. Aris just leaned back, steepled his fingers, and asked, "Caleb, how long have you been performing the role of okayness just to make your parents comfortable with their own neglect?" I stared at him for a full minute before bursting into tears. Therapy shattered me and slowly rebuilt me. I realized my obsession with being the low-maintenance, independent son was a trauma response. If my parents didn't value me, I convinced myself that needing their validation was a weakness. I had twisted their profound neglect into my own identity and proudly called it maturity. Dr. Aris taught me how to set ironclad boundaries. He told me, "You can love people from a distance without constantly handing them the knife they used to stab you." While I was doing the grueling emotional work in the background, something explosive was happening with my business. Right around the time of the birthday fallout, I was contacted by a very high-profile interior designer named Elena, based out of Raleigh, North Carolina. She had seen my work in the architectural magazine and wanted to commission a massive, custom dining set for a wealthy client's new estate. A massive Appalachian walnut table, 10 matching chairs, and a sprawling buffet. The budget she offered was staggering, $22,000. Imposter syndrome screamed in my head, but Maya stood directly behind my office chair and refused to let me move until I typed out the acceptance email. I spent 4 grueling months on that dining set. I am talking 16-hour days in my shop, meticulously hand-selecting every single slab of walnut, cutting complex dovetail joints that nobody would ever even see, just because I demanded absolute perfection. When I finally delivered the pieces to the estate, the client actually burst into tears. She called it the most exquisite furniture she had ever seen. Elena took professional photographs, plastered them all over her high-profile design portfolio, and tagged my business. That was the spark that ignited a powder keg. Within 3 months, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Elena referred me to 4 other luxury designers. A boutique hotel in downtown Charlottesville commissioned me to build custom, live-edge headboards and nightstands for 30 luxury suites. A high-end restaurant owner ordered a massive 30-foot epoxy river bar top. I was drowning in lucrative work. I had to hire my first full-time employee, a brilliant craftsman named Sam. 2 months later, I hired a joinery specialist named Chloe. By the end of the summer, I officially incorporated as Caleb Vance Woodworks. I signed a commercial lease on a massive 15,000 square foot warehouse. I had a team of 6 people. I had a sleek website Maya designed. I was pulling in more money in a month than I used to make in a year. I was finally building an empire with my own name on it. That same summer, I proposed to Maya. I did it on the wraparound porch of the house we had just officially purchased together. I custom carved a ring box out of rare black walnut, featuring a tiny, intricate inlay of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She said yes before I even finished my sentence. It was the happiest moment of my life, and I didn't bother telling my parents about the engagement for 3 full weeks. When I finally casually mentioned it during a brief, strained phone call with my mom, her immediate response was, "Oh, that's nice. You know, Paige and Liam are thinking about buying a bigger house in Atlanta soon." I just smiled, said goodbye, and hung up. I didn't even feel the sting anymore. We skipped Thanksgiving in Richmond. We hosted our own massive Friendsgiving in Charlottesville. My mom sent a barrage of passive-aggressive texts about how disappointed my father was, but I just ignored them. We skipped Christmas, too. I was completely detached. I was finally free. And then, the universe delivered a massive plot twist. In early April, Liam got laid off. The corporate marketing firm he worked for in Atlanta went bankrupt, and despite Liam being the golden child of the universe, his charm couldn't save him from corporate restructuring. He called me to vent, sounding genuinely terrified and lost. I felt terrible for him. Regardless of our parents' toxicity, Liam was still my brother, and I didn't want him to suffer. I offered him emotional support and told him to keep his head up. But 2 days later my phone rang. The caller ID said Times Tom Vance. My father, the man who had given me 7 words for my birthday, was calling me on a random Tuesday afternoon. Curiosity got the better of me, so I answered. Caleb, my dad started, his voice dripping with an unnatural, forced camaraderie. Your brother is in a really tough spot. I was wondering if you might have some menial work for him at your little shop. Just something to keep cash in his pocket while he figures his life out. I sat back in my leather office chair and stared at the ceiling. My father, who had never once asked about my business, who had never visited my shop, who had never even looked at my website, was now calling to demand I give his favorite son a pity job at my company. I kept my voice dangerously calm. Dad, do you even know what my company does? There was a long, awkward silence on the line. You build furniture, right? Tables and stuff? Tables and stuff. I had just signed a massive $75,000 commercial contract to furnish a luxury resort. I had 6 employees on payroll. And my father thought I made tables and stuff in a garage. I politely informed him that my commercial manufacturing facility was not equipped to hire unskilled laborers with 0 woodworking experience, and that Liam should focus on his own career field. My dad's voice instantly turned cold. I just thought family was supposed to help family. Caleb. The hypocrisy was so thick it was practically choking me. A month later, my mom called with a new tactic. She brightly announced that she, my dad, Liam, and Paige wanted to drive up to Charlottesville for a weekend to finally see our new house and visit the little shop. Maya looked at me and said, "Let them come. It's time they step into your world." I agreed to host them for exactly 1 afternoon, a house tour, a shop tour, and a dinner. The Saturday they arrived was exactly 1 year after the birthday disaster. They pulled into the driveway of our beautiful craftsman home. My mom walked inside, looked at the stunning, custom-built furniture filling every room, and said, "Oh, this is cute," in the same tone you use to compliment a child's macaroni art. My dad was mostly silent. Liam, however, looked genuinely shocked. He kept running his hands over the dining table, muttering, "Dude, you built this? This is incredible." Then, I took them to the commercial shop. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I unlocked the heavy steel doors to my 15,000 square foot warehouse. The massive industrial saws were humming, the air smelled of rich cedar and lacquer, and my 6 employees were busy assembling high-end pieces. I walked my family past the massive lumber racks, the high-tech CNC machines, and the dedicated finishing rooms. I pointed to the design board covered in blueprints for luxury hotels. My dad stopped dead in the middle of the warehouse floor. He looked at the massive scale of the operation, the expensive machinery, the stacks of completed luxury furniture waiting for freight shipping. For the first time in 26 years, I saw something break behind his eyes. He looked completely caught off guard. He swallowed hard and quietly muttered, This is a real operation you have here." I didn't say a word. I just smiled. But the real explosion was waiting for us at dinner. Update 2. I booked a table at an upscale, quiet restaurant in downtown Charlottesville. I wanted this conversation on my turf. For the first hour, the conversation was agonizingly superficial. But right as dessert was being served, my mom couldn't help herself. She leaned across the table, put on her best pleading face, and said, "Caleb, honey, are you absolutely sure you can't find a little corner in your shop for Liam? Just a small management role? It would mean the absolute world to your father and me. A little corner in my shop." I carefully set my fork down. Maya slipped her hand onto my knee. I looked directly at my mother, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Mom, before I answer that, I need to ask you a question. Do you have any idea what my company's gross revenue was last year?" My mom blinked, completely confused. My dad slowly looked up from his coffee. Liam and Paige froze. "It was just over $410,000, I stated clearly. I have 6 full-time employees. I have commercial contracts, spanning 4 states. I am currently outfitting a $75,000 luxury resort in the mountains. This is not a little shop I run out of a garage. This is a massive corporate entity. It is my life's work. And the fact that you are sitting here, begging me to invent a fake job for your golden child in a business you know absolutely nothing about, tells me everything I need to know." The table went dead silent. The air was sucked entirely out of the room. My mom's jaw actually dropped. But it was my dad's reaction that changed everything. My dad didn't look proud. He didn't look ashamed. His eyes suddenly lit up with a frantic, desperate kind of greed. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly, and the massive, shocking twist of my family's perfect facade finally revealed itself. "Caleb," my dad started, his voice cracking. "Son, that is incredible. Truly, I am so proud of you. In fact, your mother and I have been meaning to talk to you about a family investment opportunity." Liam looked at our dad, his brow furrowed in utter confusion. "Dad, what are you talking about?" My dad ignored Liam entirely, his desperate eyes locked onto me. The truth spilled out like vomit. For the past 3 years, the commercial real estate market in Richmond had been completely brutalizing my father's firm. He was practically bankrupt. But instead of downsizing their lavish lifestyle, my dad had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on their Richmond house to keep up appearances. Worse, he confessed that he had been secretly funneling tens of thousands of dollars to Liam to help pay for Liam's extravagant wedding and luxury apartment in Atlanta, using high-interest credit lines. My dad had built an entire mountain of debt just to maintain the illusion that Liam was a massive success and that our family was flawless. "The bank is threatening foreclosure, Caleb," my dad whispered, looking around the restaurant nervously. "I thought if Liam got a job with you, he could start paying me back. But if your business is pulling in $500,000, Caleb, I need a loan. I need $150,000 to save the family home. Family helps family, right?" I sat there, completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity. The 26 years of neglect, the birthday speech, the constant dismissal. It wasn't just blind favoritism. It was transactional. My dad only worshipped Liam because Liam fit the aesthetic of a successful son. And the absolute second Liam faltered, and the second my dad realized times was the one hoarding the actual wealth, he immediately tried to pivot and bleed me dry to save his own skin. I looked at Liam. My brother looked like he had just been hit by a freight train. The horror dawning on his face was absolute. Liam finally realized that he wasn't truly loved. He was just a shiny trophy our dad used to stroke his own ego. And now that the trophy was tarnished, Dad was trying to pawn it off. I looked back at my father. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of pity. "Dad," I said softly, leaning over the table, "I remember my 26th birthday. I remember sitting there while you talked about Liam for 10 minutes. And then you looked at me, and you gave me exactly 7 words. Do you remember what they were?" My dad swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead. He couldn't speak. I stood up from the table, dropped a $100 bill on the wood to cover my meal, and looked down at the man who had ignored me my entire life. "I have exactly 7 words for you now," I said, making sure every syllable landed like a hammer strike. "I will never give you a dime." I took Maya's hand and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them sitting in the wreckage of their own making. That was a year ago. The fallout was apocalyptic. My dad's firm completely collapsed, and the bank foreclosed on the Richmond house. My parents are currently renting a tiny 2-bedroom apartment and fighting constantly. I haven't spoken to either of them since that night in the restaurant, and I never will again. The truly surprising part of this story is Liam. That night shattered the golden illusion for him. He realized our parents had financially weaponized his life and set him up for failure just to brag to their country club friends. Liam completely cut ties with our dad, too. Without the toxic pressure of being the perfect son, Liam actually humbled himself. He moved to a smaller, affordable apartment with Paige, took a grueling entry-level job in a completely different industry, and started going to intense therapy. We talk on the phone once a week now. It's awkward, and we have a lot of baggage to unpack, but for the first time in our lives, we are actually building a real brotherhood without our parents pulling the strings. As for me, Caleb Vance Woodworks just cleared $600,000 in revenue this year. Maya and I got married last month in the backyard of our beautiful home, surrounded by friends who actually see us and love us. My parents weren't invited. Liam was my best man. If you are out there reading this, and you are the invisible child in your family, I want you to hear this loud and clear. The people who refuse to see your worth do not hold the pen to your story. Stop begging for a seat at their table. Walk away, build your own table with your own 2 hands, and only invite the people who actually value the craftsmanship. Top comments. User 1. The absolute unmitigated gall of your father to ignore you for 26 years. Call your life's work a little shop, and then immediately pivot to begging for $150K when he realized you were rich. The 7 words line at the end was pure cinematic perfection. You dropped a nuke on that table. User 2. I am so incredibly happy for Liam's character arc. Most golden children never wake up from the delusion. The fact that he realized your dad was just using him as a prop to fund his own ego, and then actively chose to cut him off and rebuild a relationship with you, is the best plot twist here. User 3. I will never give you a dime. Exactly 7 words. I literally got chills reading that. You built an empire out of the scraps they threw at you, and when they tried to eat at your table, you served them nothing but reality. Masterpiece. Wishing you and Maya a beautiful marriage. My parents demanded $50,000 to save my sister's ruined wedding after banning me from it. I said no, then discovered the reason: the wedding was cancelled. My parents uninvited me from my sister's wedding because my presence was too triggering for her perfect day, so I packed my bags, muted my phone, and flew to a beach in Belize. But when my dad called me mid-vacation begging for $50,000 to save the family after the wedding mysteriously fell apart, I didn't just refuse, I dug into the truth. Uncovered a massive financial felony my sister was desperately trying to hide, and let her wealthy fiancé burn her entire life to the ground. I'm Maya, I'm 29 years old, and I work as a senior financial auditor for a corporate firm. I make a very good living, which is an important detail for later. My sister, Chloe, is 26. To say Chloe is the golden child of our family would be the understatement of the century. Chloe is the sun, the moon, and the stars in my parents' universe, and I am essentially the dark matter that just takes up space in the background. Growing up, the dynamic was blatantly obvious to everyone except my parents, Richard and Helen. If Chloe wanted a new laptop for high school, my dad would work overtime to buy her a MacBook Pro. When I needed a laptop for college, I was handed a bulky, 5-year-old hand-me-down that sounded like a jet engine and told that hardship builds character. When Chloe wrecked her brand new car by texting and driving, my parents emptied their savings to pay for the damages, so her insurance wouldn't go up. When I got a flat tire on my way to my college graduation, my dad told me to look up a YouTube tutorial on how to use a jack because he was busy helping Chloe pick out a dress for a sorority party. I learned early on that I was completely on my own. I stopped asking for help. I put myself through college with scholarships and 3 part-time jobs. I built my career from the ground up, bought my own condo, and created a quiet, stable, peaceful life for myself. I wasn't bitter, or at least, I tried very hard not to be. I accepted that my parents simply loved her more, in a loud, performative way, and I kept my distance to protect my own peace. But things took a massive turn for the worse when Chloe got engaged to Julian. Julian is 31, a wildly successful architect who comes from a very wealthy, prominent old money family in our city. When Chloe brought him home, my parents practically salivated. They treated Julian like royalty, and Chloe paraded him around like a shiny new accessory. I genuinely liked Julian. He was polite, grounded, and seemed completely oblivious to the toxic, manipulative underbelly of my family. I was happy for Chloe. I truly was. I thought maybe marrying into a good family would force her to mature. I couldn't have been more wrong. The wedding planning turned Chloe from a spoiled brat into a tyrannical monster. The budget was astronomical, around $120,000. Julian's parents generously offered to cover $80,000 of it, paying for the luxury country club venue, the high-end catering, and the open bar. My parents, desperate to keep up appearances, took out a second mortgage on their house to cover the remaining $40,000 for her custom designer dress, the lavish floral arrangements, and the world-class photographer. From the very beginning, I was pushed to the absolute margins. Chloe asked 6 of her sorority sisters to be bridesmaids, complete with extravagant proposal boxes filled with champagne and jewelry. I didn't get one. When I asked my mom if I was in the bridal party, she looked at me like I had just asked to wear a clown suit to the ceremony. "Oh, Maya. Sweetheart, no," my mom said, waving her hand dismissively. "Chloe's aesthetic is very specific. Her bridesmaids are all blonde, and your dark hair would just ruin the symmetry of the photos. Plus, you're so awkward in front of the camera. We don't want to stress you out." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded. Fine. I didn't want to spend $1,000 on a bridesmaid dress anyway. I offered to help with the planning instead. I offered to track the budget, literally my professional expertise, but Chloe scoffed at me. "I don't need a spreadsheet, Maya, I need vibes. You wouldn't understand." Over the next few months, I was systematically excluded from everything. I wasn't invited to the dress fitting, I was left off the group chat for the bridal shower. When I bought a beautiful, modest navy blue dress as a guest, Chloe texted me demanding I return it because navy was Julian's mother's color and I was trying to upstage her. I bit my tongue. I kept my head down. I just wanted to get through the wedding, smile for a few photos, and go back to my quiet life. But then, 3 weeks before the wedding, I got the phone call that shattered whatever fragile illusion of family I was still holding on to. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just gotten home from work and was making dinner when my mom called. Her voice was tight, clipped, and completely void of warmth. "Maya, we need to have a serious conversation about the wedding," she began. "Okay. What's going on? Is everything all right with the caterer?" I asked, stirring my pasta. "The caterer is fine. It's about you," she said. She let out a heavy sigh. The kind of dramatic sigh she uses when she's about to play the victim. Chloe has been having severe panic attacks lately. The stress of the wedding is just eating her alive. She's been talking to her therapist, and they both agree that she needs to eliminate all sources of negative energy from her life right now. I stopped stirring. The kitchen suddenly felt very cold. Negative energy? Mom, what are you talking about? Maya, please don't make this harder than it has to be, she snapped, her tone turning defensive. Chloe feels like you've been extremely unsupportive. You're always so quiet and judgmental at family dinners. You don't match the joyful energy she needs. Your presence is honestly just triggering for her. So, we've decided that it's best if you don't attend the wedding. I stood there in my kitchen, the phone pressed against my ear, completely paralyzed. My own sister. My own parents. They were uninviting me from the biggest day of her life because my energy wasn't joyful enough. After a lifetime of being ignored, pushed aside, and treated like an afterthought, I was now being formally banished. You're uninviting me? I whispered, my voice trembling. Mom, I'm your daughter, I'm her sister, I haven't done anything wrong. See, this is exactly what she means. My mom raised her voice. Always playing the victim. Always making it about you. It is Chloe's day. She deserves to be surrounded by people who uplift her. If you actually loved her, you would understand and step aside gracefully. A deep, burning anger flared in my chest. Decades of resentment bubbled to the surface, but I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just felt a terrifying, icy calm wash over me. Understood, I said softly. Oh, thank you, Maya, I knew you'd I hung up the phone. I didn't shed a single tear. I walked over to my laptop, opened a new tab, and looked up last-minute flights. If my presence was so triggering, I would remove it entirely. I booked a 10-day solo trip to a luxury beachfront resort in Belize. I scheduled it so I would leave a week before the wedding and return a few days after. It cost me a small fortune, but I didn't care. I needed to be as far away from them as physically possible. The next morning, I sent a brief text to my dad, my mom, and Chloe in a group chat. I respect your decision to uninvite me. I will not attend the wedding, and I will not be in the country. I wish you all the best. Please do not contact me. Then, I blocked their numbers, packed my bags, and flew to Central America. For the first week, it was paradise. I drank margaritas on the beach, read books by the crystal clear water, and slept for 10 hours a night. For the first time in my life, I felt completely untethered from the heavy, suffocating weight of my family's expectations. The day of the wedding came and went. I spent that Saturday snorkeling and eating fresh ceviche. I didn't look at social media. I didn't care what kind of dress Chloe wore or how perfect her photos looked. I was free. But drama, like a parasite, always finds a way to latch back onto you. Update 1. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after the wedding was supposed to happen. I was lying on a sun lounger, staring out at the ocean, when my phone vibrated. I had unblocked my parents the night before, just in case there was a legitimate medical emergency while I was out of the country. It was my dad. I stared at the caller ID, feeling a knot twist in my stomach. Against my better judgment, I answered it. Hello? I said cautiously. Maya. Oh my God, Maya, thank God you answered. My dad's voice was frantic, breathless, and laced with absolute panic. There was no greeting. No, how is your trip? Just raw, unfiltered desperation. We need your help. You have to come home right now. Everything is ruined. Everything. Everything is ruined. Everything. I sat up, pulling my sunglasses down. What are you talking about? Didn't the wedding happen on Saturday? No. There was no wedding. He cried out, his voice cracking. It's a disaster, Maya. Chloe had a massive mental breakdown on the morning of the wedding. She completely lost her mind. That, Maya. She locked herself in her room, screaming that she couldn't go through with it. Julian was devastated. The guests were already arriving. We had to send everyone home. The whole thing was cancelled. I blinked, processing the information. Chloe, the girl who had planned this wedding like a military general, got cold feet and cancelled it on the day of? It didn't make any sense. I'm sorry to hear that, Dad, but what does that have to do with me? I'm in Belize. I told you not to contact me. Maya, listen to me. He practically shouted. Because she cancelled on the day of the wedding, none of the vendors are issuing refunds. The country club, the caterer, the florist, everything is gone. Julian's parents are absolutely furious. They're demanding their $80,000 back because Chloe is the one who pulled the plug. Me and your mother, we're tapped out. We took out a second mortgage for this. We have nothing left. Okay? I said, my voice hardening. Again, Dad, why are you calling me? There was a heavy, agonizing pause on the line. I could hear him breathing heavily. When he finally spoke, his voice shifted into that manipulative, pleading tone I knew all too well. Maya. You have savings. We know you do. You make great money at your firm, and you don't have a mortgage or kids. We need you to lend us $50,000. Just to get Julian's parents off our backs and pay off the remaining vendor penalties. If you don't do this, we are going to lose the house. Maya, Chloe is suicidal, the family is falling apart. You are the only one who can save us. I sat there, the tropical breeze suddenly feeling like ice against my skin. The sheer audacity, the absolute, unmitigated gall of this man. 2 weeks ago, I was a toxic presence who wasn't allowed to stand in the background of their photos. Now, I was their personal ATM, expected to drain my life savings to clean up my golden child sister's mess. A laugh bubbled up in my throat. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was dark, bitter, and completely devoid of empathy. "Are you out of your mind?" I asked, my voice deadly quiet. "Maya, please." "No, shut up and listen to me," I snapped, standing up from the lounger. "You uninvited me from the wedding. You told me I was a burden. You told me I was toxic. You deliberately pushed me out of your life to coddle Chloe's delusions. And now that she's blown up her own life, you want me to pay $50,000 for a party I wasn't even allowed to attend? Are you actually insane? You selfish little brat," my dad roared, the mask completely slipping. "This is about family. We are going to lose our home. Chloe is suffering. How can you be so heartless? You have the money sitting in a bank account doing nothing. If you don't wire us that money, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? Dead to us." "I was already dead to you, Dad," I whispered. "Good luck with the house." I hung up. I immediately blocked his number again. I blocked my mom. I blocked Chloe. I marched back to my hotel room, my hands shaking with a mixture of rage and adrenaline. I packed my bags a day early and booked the next flight back to the States. I knew this wasn't over. My parents were desperate, and desperate people do crazy things. I arrived back at my condo late Wednesday night. I locked the deadbolt, closed the blinds, and tried to sleep, but Thursday morning, my phone exploded. Since my parents couldn't reach me, they had deployed the flying monkeys. My Aunt Susan, my cousin Greg, and several of Chloe's bridesmaids were blowing up my Facebook and Instagram. "I can't believe you're letting your parents go homeless over your petty jealousy. Chloe is in the hospital on suicide watch, and you're hoarding your money like a dragon. You're disgusting. Family means being there in the hard times. Maya, step up and do the right thing." I didn't reply to a single one. I just took screenshots and blocked them all. But then, on Friday evening, the doorbell rang. I checked the peephole. It was my mom and dad. They looked awful. My dad had dark bags under his eyes, and my mom's hair was a disheveled mess. They were crying. I opened the door, leaving the chain locked. "Leave," I said firmly. "Or I'm calling the police for trespassing." "Maya, please, just open the door." My mom sobbed, pressing her hands against the doorframe. "We have nowhere else to go. Julian left her. His parents are threatening to sue us. We need the money, Maya, please. I'm begging you on my hands and knees." "You chose her," I said, staring directly into my mother's tear-filled eyes. "You chose her every single day of my life. You paid for her mistakes, you funded her vanity, and you pushed me away. This is the bed you made. Now you and Chloe get to sleep in it. Do not ever come to my house again." I slammed the door in their faces. I stood in the hallway, listening to my mother wail and my dad bang his fists against the wood. It took 20 minutes before they finally gave up and walked away. I felt a massive wave of relief, but something in the back of my mind was itching. The math wasn't adding up. I am an auditor. I deal with financial discrepancies for a living. If Julian's parents had already paid the $80,000 for the venue and catering up front, why were they demanding the money back from my parents? Usually, in a cancelled wedding scenario, the money is just lost to the vendors. You don't owe the groom's parents a refund unless you were the one holding the cash. And why were my parents suddenly facing a lawsuit from Julian's family? A cancelled wedding is a civil dispute, sure, but a lawsuit implies damages beyond just broken contracts. I needed to know the truth. Not from my lying parents, and not from my manipulative sister. I pulled out my phone, went to Instagram, and searched for Julian. I hadn't blocked him. I sent him a direct message. "Julian, it's Maya. I am so incredibly sorry for everything that has happened. My parents are harassing me for $50,000 to cover the wedding debts. Something feels very wrong here. If you have a moment, I need to know what actually happened on Saturday." I didn't expect a reply. But 10 minutes later, my phone lit up with a text message from an unknown number. "Maya, it's Julian. Can we meet for coffee? There's a lot you don't know." Update 2. I met Julian the next morning at a quiet cafe downtown. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and he had a thick stubble on his jaw. He sat down across from me, ordered a black coffee, and stared at his hands for a long time before speaking. "I'm sorry your parents are harassing you, Maya," he said quietly. "But whatever you do, do not give them a single cent." "I have no intention of giving them anything," I replied. "But Julian, what happened?" "My dad said Chloe had a panic attack and canceled the wedding." "Why are your parents threatening to sue my family?" Julian let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "A panic attack? Is that what they're calling it? Maya, Chloe didn't cancel the wedding because of cold feet. The wedding was canceled because when I showed up at the country club on Saturday morning, the doors were locked. The event manager told me our reservation had been terminated 3 weeks prior due to non-payment. I froze. My coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. Non-payment? But your parents gave her the $80,000 for the venue and catering months ago. Julian looked up at me, his eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and fury. Yes, my parents wired $80,000 directly into a joint wedding account that Chloe was managing. But she didn't pay the country club, Maya. She didn't pay the caterer. She didn't pay the florist. My auditor brain immediately kicked into overdrive. Where did the money go, Julian? He pulled out his phone, unlocked it, and slid it across the table to me. It was a screenshot of bank statements. Pages and pages of transfers. She stole it, Julian whispered, his voice cracking. She completely drained the account. Over the course of 6 months, Chloe transferred $75,000 to a guy named Marcus, an ex-boyfriend of hers from college. I hired a private investigator on Monday. Turns out, Chloe had been secretly seeing Marcus our entire relationship. Marcus is a crypto investor who got into massive debt with some very bad people. Chloe took my parents' money, the money meant for our wedding, and gave it to her secret boyfriend to pay off his gambling and crypto debts. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands started to shake. Grand larceny, wire fraud, embezzlement. My sister didn't just ruin a wedding. She committed a massive, 6-figure felony against her wealthy fiancé's family. The panic attack on Saturday morning? Julian continued, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. It was a performance. She knew the venue was cancelled. She knew there was no food, no flowers, no nothing. She faked a mental breakdown so she could play the victim and cancel the wedding before everyone found out she had stolen the money. Oh my God, I breathed, covering my mouth in sheer horror. Julian, I am so sorry. My parents are out for blood, Maya, he said, his voice hardening into stone. My dad's lawyers have already drafted the paperwork. They gave your parents an ultimatum, pay back the $80,000 she stole by next Friday, or we are going to the police with the bank statements and pressing criminal charges for grand larceny and fraud. Chloe will go to state prison. The puzzle pieces violently slammed into place in my mind. My parents didn't need $50,000 to pay off vendor penalties. They needed $50,000 to add to their own remaining funds to pay off Julian's family. They were trying to extort my life savings to cover up Chloe's felony and keep their golden child out of a jail cell. And they had the absolute nerve to try and guilt-trip me into doing it by playing the family emergency card, without ever telling me the truth. A rage unlike anything I have ever experienced in my entire life ignited inside my chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a cold, calculating, volcanic fury. Julian, I said, sliding the phone back to him. Do you have the bank statements? The proof of the transfers? Yes, he said. The lawyers have everything. Send them to me, I demanded. Right now. He didn't argue. He airdropped the PDF files directly to my phone. I thanked him, paid for his coffee, and walked to my car. I didn't drive home. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the evidence of my sister's breathtaking deceit. Then, I opened the family group chat. The one with my mom, my dad, Chloe, and my extended family, Aunt Susan, Cousin Greg, and the flying monkeys who had been harassing me all week. I typed out the following message. To everyone who has been harassing me for the last 5 days, calling me selfish, and demanding I empty my bank account to save the family, I just had a very enlightening coffee with Julian. Attached are the bank statements proving that Chloe did not have a panic attack. Chloe stole $80,000 from Julian's family and funneled it to her ex-boyfriend Marcus to pay off his gambling debts. There was no wedding venue on Saturday because Chloe embezzled the funds. Mom and Dad didn't ask me for a loan to pay vendors. They tried to extort $50,000 from me to pay off Julian's family before they pressed criminal charges for grand larceny. I will not be paying a single cent to keep a thief out of prison. Do not ever contact me again. If you do, I will file a restraining order. I attached the 1-4-page PDF of the bank statements. I hit send. I didn't wait to see the read receipts. I didn't wait for the frantic typing bubbles to appear. I instantly blocked every single number in that group chat. I went to all my social media platforms, posted the exact same message with the exact same screenshots for all her sorority sisters and friends to see, and then I deactivated my accounts. I nuked her entire world from orbit, and I didn't lose a single second of sleep over it. It has been 3 months since that day. The fallout was absolutely apocalyptic. Because the truth was made public, Julian's parents didn't just want the money back, they wanted blood. They officially pressed charges against Chloe. She was arrested 2 weeks later at my parents' house. From what I heard through a mutual friend, my parents tried to hire a high-powered defense attorney, but because they had already drained their equity for the wedding, they couldn't afford a good lawyer. They are completely bankrupt. The bank foreclosed on their house last month, and they are currently renting a tiny 2-bedroom apartment on the bad side of town. Chloe is currently out on bail, awaiting trial. She is facing multiple felony charges for wire fraud and grand theft. Marcus, her ex-boyfriend, took a plea deal and threw her completely under the bus, testifying that she orchestrated the entire theft. She is looking at a minimum of 3 to 5 years in state prison. All of her bridesmaids abandoned her. Her reputation is completely destroyed. As for me, I got a promotion at work. I bought myself a beautiful new car. I sleep 8 hours a night, I drink wine on my balcony, and I live in absolute, unbothered peace. For 29 years, I was the family scapegoat. I was the dark matter they ignored while they worshipped the sun. But in the end, the sun burned their entire world to ash, and I was safely watching from the shade. Top comments. User 1. Holy sh times T. This is the most satisfying nuclear revenge I have ever read on this app. Your parents literally tried to make you an accessory to grand larceny by tricking you into paying off a felony, and they tried to use family loyalty to do it. The absolute audacity of your mother, to say your energy was triggering. Yeah, your energy of not being a literal criminal was probably throwing off Chloe's embezzlement vibes. Enjoy your peace, OP. User 2. As an accountant, reading about those bank transfers made me physically gasp. She wired $75K to an ex-boyfriend from a joint wedding account and thought nobody would notice? What was her endgame? Just fake panic attacks for the rest of her life. The fact that Julian's family went scorched earth and pressed charges is beautiful. Let her rot in a cell. Good on you for exposing the whole family to the flying monkeys. User 3. The fact that your dad screamed at you that you were dead to them while secretly begging you for hush money to keep his golden child out of federal prison is textbook narcissism. They literally lost their house, their reputation, and their daughter all because they couldn't stop enabling her. You didn't just dodge a bullet, Maya, you dodged an entire ballistic missile. Cheers to your promotion and your new car. Mom and sister locked me out of the family bakery to ban me from dad's will reading. So I let them hold the meeting, and let the lawyers ruin their lives. My older sister looked me dead in the eye and told me I was entirely cut out of our father's $4.5 million estate, explicitly instructing me to skip the final inheritance meeting so I wouldn't clutter the process. I nodded, stayed home, and let her walk right into the ironclad legal trap our father had meticulously set for her. My name is Chloe. I am 30 years old, and until that freezing Tuesday afternoon, I still believed that maintaining silence could keep my family from completely falling apart. When my older sister, Elena, 34, looked at me across the stainless steel counter of our family's flagship bakery, there was absolutely no hesitation in her voice and no room left for any kind of discussion. She told me directly that I had no claim whatsoever to what our father left behind, speaking as if the outcome had already been signed, sealed, and delivered by a judge. She said, "You won't get a single dime, Chloe, not even $1. Then, instead of offering any sort of explanation or justification, she followed it up with cold, hard instructions. She told me not to show up at the formal asset division and estate reading scheduled for that upcoming Sunday. According to her, my presence would be nothing more than an emotional burden that would only slow things down. The way she delivered these words made it abundantly clear that she was not asking for my cooperation or my permission. She was simply informing me that I no longer mattered in the process of dismantling our father's life's work. I did not argue with her. I did not scream, I did not cry, and I did not ask how she had reached such a finalized conclusion or who else in the family had agreed with her. I just stood there, listened to her icy tone, nodded exactly once, and let her walk away believing that I had accepted every single word at face value. What I kept strictly to myself in that agonizing moment was the simple fact that arguing with a narcissist would have changed absolutely nothing, and showing my hand too early would have been a catastrophic mistake. If you want to understand exactly how I went from being entirely excluded from my own family to holding all the leverage without ever stepping foot into that boardroom, stay with me and hear how this nightmare actually unfolded. To understand the sheer magnitude of Elena's betrayal, you have to understand what our father built. My father, Marcus, was a force of nature. He didn't just own a business, he breathed life into it. Over 30 years, he built Marcus & Co. Artisanal roasters and bakery from a tiny, drafty storefront in Seattle into a thriving, highly profitable chain of 3 locations across the city. The business was currently valued at roughly $4.5 million. But to Dad, it was never about the valuation. He treated his bakeries less like a corporate asset, and more like a living, breathing extension of our family. Dad died after a brutal, agonizing 14-month battle with pancreatic cancer. It was an illness that drained him physically, stripping away the robust, flour-dusted man I grew up with, but it never fully took him away from his work until the very last weeks. Even from his hospital bed, with IVs strapped to his thinning arms, he reviewed inventory sheets, approved payroll personally, and kept the financial records incredibly close to his chest. He did this not because he distrusted his employees, but because he believed that the responsibility of leadership should never be handed over lightly. While he was alive, nothing about the bakeries belonged to just one person. Every major decision was discussed around our cracked oak dining table. Sometimes those decisions were postponed, and often they were left unresolved because my father preferred extreme caution over reckless speed. No single child was ever formally positioned as the sole successor, and that fragile balance held us together much longer than I realized at the time. After the funeral, which was a blur of black umbrellas and the smell of wet Seattle asphalt, that restraint disappeared almost instantaneously. My sister Elena returned to the house with a terrifying sense of urgency that felt significantly less like grief and much more like corporate purpose. Within a matter of days, she was present at the flagship bakery every single morning at 5 a.m. She was suddenly speaking with our wholesale flour suppliers, aggressively reviewing employee schedules, and positioning herself as the sole point of contact for anyone who mattered. None of this was ever formally announced to the staff or to me. Yet, it became crystal clear through her aggressive actions rather than her words that she had decided the transition of power was already complete. I started noticing the terrifying shift when routine decisions completely stopped passing through me. I had worked at the bakeries alongside Dad since I was 16. I knew the espresso machines, I knew the regular customers, and I knew the accounting software. Suddenly, my login credentials for the QuickBooks accounts were revoked. When I asked the shift managers for financial updates, their responses were incredibly vague, nervously framed as temporary measures taken during a difficult time under Elena's orders. Conversations that once included me naturally now happened behind closed, locked office doors. Nothing was ever presented to me as a final decision, yet the pattern was so consistent it was unmistakable. What hurt the most was that our mother, Diane, supported Elena openly and enthusiastically. Mom insisted that the business needed one clear, authoritative voice to stay stable after everything we had lost. Mom constantly spoke about efficiency, corporate continuity, and the absolute importance of keeping messy emotions out of business even when those emotions belonged to her own grieving youngest daughter. In my mother's warped view, Elena's ruthless leadership mattered far more than fairness. Hesitation was a risk we simply could not afford. What unsettled me to my core was how quickly the bakery completely stopped feeling like something we shared as a family. It became a weapon. It became leverage, a source of absolute authority that dictated who was included and who was informed only after decisions had already been made in secret. The very language they used around the business changed almost overnight. What had once been lovingly referred to as our family store was now coldly described by Elena as the primary asset. It was suddenly something to be managed, positioned, and eventually liquidated if the timing felt right. I did not challenge that shift directly at first. At the time, I was still drowning in the raw grief of losing my dad. It seemed entirely pointless to argue while everything was still being framed to me as temporary. Yet, with each passing week, the emotional distance grew clearer. The bakeries that had once represented continuity and warmth now stood at the dead center of a quiet, vicious power struggle I had never agreed to enter. A few weeks later, the conversation officially moved from management control to outright ownership. Elena did not frame it as an idea or a gentle discussion when she finally brought it up. She spoke about selling all 3 bakery locations to a massive, sterile corporate hospitality franchise as if the decision had already passed through every necessary legal step. She described this massive corporate buyout as the most financially responsible option given the current market circumstances. According to her, holding on to the business no longer made sense, and waiting would only reduce its multi-million-dollar value. The language she used was arrogant, confident, and entirely forward-focused. She emphasized market conditions, profit margins, and liquidation timelines rather than family history, employee loyalty, or the long-term implications for the community Dad loved. What stood out to me was not just the horrific plan itself, but how incredibly far along it already seemed to be. Legal documents were mentioned casually in passing. High-end corporate brokers had clearly already been contacted. Massive financial numbers were referenced without any context provided to me. I was never asked whether I agreed with the $4.5 million valuation, nor was I ever consulted about the timing of the sale. The entire process had moved ahead quietly without my consent, my signature, or my involvement, as though my position as a legal heir simply did not factor into the outcome at all. When I finally pushed back and asked how the bakeries had been assessed so quickly, and whether multiple offers had been considered, Elena dismissed my questions with a wave of her hand. She said the intricate details were being handled by professionals and that there was absolutely no need to complicate things with too many emotional opinions. Her tone was firm rather than defensive, heavily suggesting that my curiosity was a childish inconvenience rather than a legal right. It was abundantly clear that the conversation was not meant to invite my input, only my blind acceptance. I pressed her once more, feeling physically nauseous at the thought of strangers tearing down Dad's signs. I asked why a decision of that massive magnitude was being rushed so aggressively soon after his death. The bakeries had not been struggling financially. In fact, we had our most profitable quarter right before Dad passed. There had been absolutely no indication that immediate action or liquidation was required. Elena responded by completely shifting the focus away from the business itself. She coldly stated that prolonged discussions only created delays and unnecessary family tension. In her view, efficiency mattered more than consensus, and moving quickly was framed as a form of responsibility rather than what it truly was, total control. That was the exact moment she made her position unmistakable. That was when she delivered the ultimatum. She told me there was absolutely no reason for me to attend the formal inheritance and estate reading meeting scheduled for that upcoming Sunday with Dad's lawyers. According to Elena, my presence would only complicate matters that were already being efficiently managed. She said the meeting was purely procedural, something that just needed to happen on paper so everything could move forward smoothly with the corporate brokers. She looked at me with a smirk and said there was nothing for me to contribute. I asked her directly, my voice shaking with restrained anger, why I was being excluded from a legal meeting that involved assets we both had a legal stake in as his daughters. Her response avoided the core question entirely. She said this was not about exclusion, but about practicality. She repeated that fewer voices made the legal process easier. There was no mention of mutual agreement, no acknowledgement whatsoever that my consent might legally matter. There was only the arrogant assumption that my absence would simplify the outcome for her. Mom supported Elena's position without a single shred of hesitation. Mom agreed that it would be vastly better if I just stayed away, saying that the family had already been through enough stress, and that reducing friction should be our top priority. In Mom's view, the lawyer's boardroom was not a place for emotions or unresolved sibling disagreements, and my attendance was framed as a potential chaotic disruption rather than a legal right. The conversation ended without any resolution, not because there was nothing left to say, but because the boundaries had been drawn with permanent marker. The bakeries were no longer being treated as something we shared, but as a transaction to be finalized. Decisions were being made in advance, my access was being actively limited, and my role had quietly been shifted from participant to an unwanted observer. I did not argue further. At that exact point, it was painfully obvious that logic, fairness, or tears would not change the direction things were moving. What mattered was not whether the plan made sense, but who was being allowed to shape it. The shift from managing the store to deciding its permanent fate marked the moment when the conflict stopped being subtle and became completely irreversible. Update 1. Shortly after that horrific conversation, I stopped asking my sister for updates and started actively verifying facts. I realized that every single answer I received from Elena was heavily filtered through her own convenience rather than the truth. Questions about the corporate brokers were deflected, timelines were softened, and her blatant power grab was framed as urgent responsibility. Instead of pushing back directly and showing her my suspicions, I decided to look elsewhere for clarity. The very first person who came to my mind was my father's former executive assistant, Sarah. Sarah had worked with Dad for over 15 years. She knew the business inside and out, and she had remained quietly absent since the funeral. I knew for a fact that Elena had unceremoniously fired Sarah via a 2-sentence email just 3 days after Dad was buried, claiming her position was redundant. When I reached out to Sarah, she responded without a moment's hesitation. She asked me to meet her at a small, rainy diner in West Seattle, far away from the bakeries. When I arrived, the smell of cheap coffee and wet raincoats filled the air. Sarah didn't ask why I was calling or what I hoped to hear. She simply looked at me with a sad, knowing smile and said she had been expecting this exact moment to come eventually. During our 2-hour conversation in that diner booth, Sarah confirmed something that immediately shifted my entire understanding of the situation. My father, Marcus, had not left matters unresolved, messy, or informal, as Elena constantly implied. He had prepared his will meticulously, carefully revising it more than once with a team of lawyers as his health rapidly declined. He wanted to ensure that every single clause reflected his deliberate, calculated intent rather than last-minute emotional decisions. Sarah explained that Dad had worked incredibly closely with his lead attorney, Mr. Vance, during his final months. He reviewed not only the asset distribution but also the strict conditions tied to management decisions involving the family bakeries. He had been crystal clear about separating ownership from control, knowing full well that confusion between the two often created conflict rather than unity. According to Sarah, those distinctions were not vague suggestions scribbled on a napkin. They were formal, ironclad legal provisions documented and signed while he was fully competent and aware. Before ending our diner meeting, Sarah reached into her leather tote bag and handed me a thick, sealed envelope. I recognized it immediately by the sharp, careful handwriting on the front. It was a letter from my father, written in his distinct script sometime before his condition worsened to the point where he couldn't hold a pen. Sarah said she had been given strict instructions by Dad to hand this letter over to me only if certain circumstances arose, circumstances that now felt painfully, devastatingly obvious. I did not open the letter right away. Just holding the thick paper was enough to confirm what I had already begun to suspect in my gut. My father had fully anticipated this exact tension between his children, and he had planned accordingly. When I finally got home and sat on my couch, my hands shaking, I opened the envelope. The letter was not meant to explain his legal decisions in tedious detail, or to comfort me emotionally with platitudes. Its sole purpose was to acknowledge what he knew would happen, and to remind me that silence did not mean exclusion. Reading it reinforced my understanding of the man he was. The message was measured, practical, and unmistakably intentional. My father did not accuse Elena of being evil, nor did he warn me to fight her. He simply outlined his reasoning with calm, surgical clarity, emphasizing preparation over reaction. He wrote, "Chloe, if Sarah has given you this letter, it means the worst parts of my fears have come true. It means your sister has tried to shut you out. Elena has always confused access with authority, and aggression with leadership. I have structured my estate to protect the business, but more importantly, to protect you from her worst instincts. Do not fight her in the dirt, let the documents do the fighting. Follow Mr. Vance's lead. I love you, and I trust you." It became glaringly clear that my exclusion from recent decisions was not an oversight by Dad, but a massive, fatal miscalculation by Elena, who assumed that holding the keys equaled holding the power. That realization fundamentally changed how I viewed the upcoming Sunday meeting. What Elena had framed as a necessary gathering to finalize her corporate buyout now appeared to be procedural rather than decisive. The key outcomes had already been determined through legal channels long before Elena's greed entered the equation. Attendance, I suddenly understood, was not a requirement for legitimacy, but a performance designed to reinforce Elena's illusion of control. For the very first time since my father passed away, the heavy knot of anxiety in my chest dissolved. I felt absolutely no pressure to correct Elena's assumptions or defend my forced absence. I saw clearly why Elena had pushed so hard to move quickly, and why my presence had suddenly become so inconvenient to her. The arrogant confidence behind her decisions relied entirely on the belief that I lacked information, not standing. With that absolute clarity, my next step was incredibly simple. I chose not to attend the meeting scheduled for that weekend. It was not an act of avoidance. It was not an act of surrender. It was a calculated decision grounded in knowledge rather than fear. Whatever unfolded in that mahogany boardroom would do so without my participation, not because I lacked interest, but because I finally understood that my position did not depend on being in the room. To ensure the trap was fully set, I sent Elena a text message on Saturday evening. I kept it brief and devoid of emotion. "Understood about tomorrow. I won't be there to complicate things. Let me know when it's done." Elena replied 3 minutes later, "Good decision. It's for the best. Don't show up. The lawyers, and Mom, and I have it handled." I took a screenshot of that text, forwarded it immediately to Sarah, and went to sleep with a profound sense of peace. That Sunday morning, the meeting went forward without me. The conference room at the downtown legal firm was prepared early, according to what I later confirmed through documents and Mr. Vance's detailed account. Mr. Vance, the lead attorney responsible for formally reading my father's will, arrived first with a massive, complete copy of the estate file. Mr. Sterling, a secondary corporate lawyer who had worked alongside my father on prior real estate matters, joined shortly after. Everyone present in the room, which included Elena, Mom, and a representative from the corporate buyout firm Elena had prematurely invited, assumed the absence of the youngest heir was procedural rather than intentional, since the formal legal notice had explicitly stated that all beneficiaries were required to attend. When the meeting began, the tone appeared incredibly controlled and confident. Elena sat at the head of the table, listening closely as the primary provisions of the will were read aloud by Mr. Vance. Those initial sections addressed general asset distribution, outstanding financial obligations, and administrative authority. Nothing in the opening language challenged Elena's expectations. From her arrogant perspective, the process seemed to be moving exactly as she had planned, reinforcing her belief that she had successfully secured total control through preparation and timing. The catastrophic shift came when Mr. Vance physically paused, closed the main folder, and cleared his throat before continuing. He referenced an additional, heavily guarded clause attached to the main document, an addendum that had been filed entirely separately but carried absolute, equal legal weight. This clause was formally known as an in terrorem or poison pill provision. It specifically addressed participation, manipulation, and interference. Mr. Vance read the clause aloud to the dead silent room. It stated, with zero ambiguity, that if any named heir was deliberately discouraged, actively misled, or explicitly excluded from attending the formal reading of the will or any subsequent decision-making sessions, the authority to manage, sell, or liquidate the contested assets would be automatically and permanently reassigned away from the offending party. The room reportedly fell deathly quiet as the dense legal language was clarified in plain English. The clause did not accuse Elena by name, but it required the attorneys to determine, right then and there, whether intentional exclusion had occurred. Mr. Vance looked directly at Elena and asked, for the official record, why Chloe was not present. Elena, completely unaware of the trap, confidently stated that I had voluntarily chosen to abstain from the process due to emotional distress. That was when Mr. Vance pulled out a secondary folder. Inside were printed copies of the communications Sarah had legally secured and submitted prior to the meeting. Those records included Elena's written instructions advising me not to attend, framing my absence as unnecessary, and the final text message from the night before explicitly telling me, "Don't show up." Under the strict terms outlined by my father, that documented behavior met the exact legal threshold of intentional obstruction and coercion. Once that determination was made by the attorneys, the consequence followed immediately, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Control over all decisions related to the family bakeries was instantly and permanently removed from Elena's authority. The will specified that in cases of interference, all executive management rights, voting shares, and liquidation authority would be redirected entirely to the non-offending heir, me. The goal was to prevent any heir from manipulating access in order to secure leverage before a final settlement. My father had foreseen her greed, and he had built a wall she crashed right into. At that exact point, the meeting could not proceed as originally intended. The corporate buyers Elena had brought along looked incredibly uncomfortable. Questions were raised, frantic objections were attempted by Elena, but the ironclad language of the trust allowed zero flexibility. The attorneys calmly explained that this specific clause had been designed precisely for situations where arrogance replaced fairness. The absolute authority that Elena believed she had secured was no longer valid under the conditions created by her very own text messages. At 10:15 a.m., 5 minutes after the clause was enforced, my phone rang. I was sitting on my couch, drinking a cup of Dad's favorite dark roast. The caller ID displayed Mr. Vance's name. His voice was remarkably controlled but carried an underlying tone of vindication when he spoke, explaining exactly what had just transpired and asking if I could come to the office later that afternoon to sign the new executive documents. Before I even had time to respond to Mr. Vance, a barrage of notifications appeared on my screen. It was a flood of frantic messages from Elena. They were drastically shorter and far less confident than anything she had sent before, desperately suggesting that perhaps the situation could still be discussed privately. I did not answer a single one of her messages. From where I stood, the outcome had already fundamentally shifted. The Sunday meeting that had been designed by my sister to finalize her control had instead perfectly activated the very safeguard my father had put in place to destroy her leverage. Without even being present in the room, I had become the central, controlling figure of the entire process, not through loud confrontation, but through meticulous documentation, patience, and timing. That Sunday ended with no resolution for Elena, no corporate signatures, and absolutely no clear path forward for the person who had expected total certainty. The authority over the multi-million-dollar business was no longer in the hands of someone who believed exclusion was a winning strategy. What had been intended as a quiet confirmation of her power turned into a devastating legal reset that could not be reversed by persuasion, crying, or pressure. Update 2. The following Monday morning, the tone completely and pathetically changed. Mom and Elena arrived unannounced at my house. They stood on my front porch, not with the blazing anger I expected at first, but with a carefully rehearsed, sickly sweet calm that felt entirely deliberate rather than sincere. They did not raise their voices or accuse me directly right away. Instead, they tried to frame the ambush visit as deep maternal and sisterly concern. Mom insisted that simple misunderstandings had escalated way too quickly, and that the family desperately needed to sit down and talk before things became legally irreversible. The shift in their behavior was immediate and unmistakable. Only 48 hours earlier, my absence had been treated as an irrelevant convenience. Now, my cooperation suddenly mattered more than anything in the world. Elena took the lead, choosing her words with visible, agonizing restraint. She said the situation with the lawyers had become more complicated than expected, and suggested that resolving it privately, just the three of us, would be better for everyone involved. She spoke passionately about preserving family dignity and avoiding unnecessary, exorbitant legal expenses, heavily emphasizing that formal court proceedings would only create emotional damage that could never be undone. Her tone heavily implied a compromise, yet her specific phrasing still assumed I would accept conditions that had already been decided without me. She wanted me to sign a waiver, nullifying the poison pill clause. I stood in my doorway and listened to them without interrupting. I didn't stay quiet because I agreed. I stayed quiet because I wanted to hear exactly how far their desperate narrative had shifted. When Elena finally stopped talking and proposed a private arrangement outside formal legal channels, I responded clearly, maintaining eye contact, and showing zero emotion. I told her, any discussion involving the bakeries, the trust, or the estate will need to go directly through Mr. Vance. Do not come to my house again. I did not negotiate terms. I did not ask for clarification. I simply stated an unbreakable boundary and refused to cross it. That response changed the atmosphere instantly. The fake smiles dropped. Elena's carefully maintained composure faltered, instantly replaced by vicious frustration she no longer attempted to disguise. She screamed, accusing me of escalating the conflict unnecessarily, and claimed that involving lawyers would completely destroy what remained of our relationship. Mom echoed that sentiment, crying fake tears, arguing that family matters should always stay within the family, and that my refusal to engage privately proved I was being spiteful and inflexible. Neither of them acknowledged the glaring fact that I had been systematically excluded from every single decision that led us to this exact point. When it became abundantly clear that I would not reconsider or let them inside my home, the conversation ended abruptly. They left my porch without resolution, slamming their car doors. Yet, the pressure did not stop at my front door. Within hours, Elena launched a massive smear campaign. She posted a long, dramatic public message on Facebook and Instagram that entirely framed the situation in her favor. She portrayed herself as the exhausted, responsible older sibling burdened with managing the horrific aftermath of our father's death, while heavily implying that I was an obstructive, greedy brat motivated by jealousy and resentment rather than principle. She avoided legal specifics, but her toxic intent was clear. The post was designed to shape public perception before the actual facts could surface. Mom supported that strategy, privately messaging family friends and encouraging Elena to prepare documentation for potential litigation. Mom described the legal process as something we needed to be ready for to protect the business from Chloe's erratic behavior, positioning herself as practical rather than confrontational. I actively chose not to respond publicly. I did not correct the narrative online, I did not reply to the confused comments from distant relatives, and I did not attempt to defend myself through indirect channels. Instead, I limited my communication entirely to my attorney, sharing every single message, post, and interaction that had followed the Sunday meeting. Silence was not passive in this case. It was highly intentional, carefully measured, and perfectly aligned with the legal framework Dad had already put in place. What stood out most that morning was how quickly their fake concern turned into aggressive pressure when my cooperation was no longer guaranteed. The appeal to family unity dissolved the exact second it failed to produce my compliance. I understood then that the conflict had moved far beyond a simple disagreement and into a brutal phase, where my restraint would be tested not by emotion, but by relentless consistency. By the end of that day, I had not spoken another word to either of them directly. Every step forward would now be documented, deliberate, and handled through formal legal channels only. Months later, the dispute finally reached the courtroom. Elena had decided to sue, attempting to invalidate the poison pill clause. By the time the case was formally scheduled, the relentless conflict had already stripped away any remaining sense of family we ever had. What remained was a cold, civil dispute grounded entirely in documents, testimony, and the precise, unforgiving language my father had chosen long before any of us realized how far things would actually go. The courtroom itself was incredibly quiet and procedural, focused on hard facts rather than messy emotion, which was exactly where my position had always been strongest. I sat beside Mr. Vance at the plaintiff's table, listening as he organized the final materials with the calm, unshakable confidence of someone who completely trusted the structure he was about to defend. Elena entered the courtroom with a very different posture. She looked exhausted, angry, and desperate. Her expensive lawyer's strategy relied entirely on asserting control through timing, authority, and the baseless assumption that her earlier access to the store's operations somehow translated into legal ownership. When the proceedings began, her attorney attempted to frame the massive dispute as a simple, tragic misunderstanding between grieving siblings. He suggested that my absence from the inheritance meeting had been entirely voluntary, and that Elena's subsequent actions with the corporate buyers were taken in good faith, to preserve the multi-million-dollar value of the business. The argument leaned heavily on emotional interpretation rather than documentation, which became increasingly, embarrassingly apparent as the hearing progressed. When Mr. Vance stood to speak, the tone in the room shifted noticeably. He did not begin with emotion, grief, or family history. Instead, he clinically outlined the exact legal structure of my father's will, emphasizing that it had been drafted with extreme foresight, and reviewed multiple times by independent counsel, while my father was fully medically competent. He explained that the document included a specific protective clause designed to prevent coercion, exclusion, or unilateral control by any single heir during the vulnerable transition period. This clause stated clearly that if an heir was deliberately discouraged or obstructed from participating in a required legal process, authority over the contested asset would be reassigned according to predetermined conditions. Mr. Vance then systematically presented the evidence. He showed the court that I had been explicitly instructed not to attend the inheritance meeting not as a gentle suggestion, but as a hostile directive. The emails, the text messages, Sarah's witness accounts, and the timing of Elena's corporate meetings all perfectly supported the undeniable conclusion that my exclusion had been highly intentional, malicious, and calculated. The judge reviewed these materials carefully, focusing on consistency rather than emotional intent. What legally mattered was not why Elena made the decision, but whether her documented actions violated the strict safeguards my father had put in place. Elena's arrogant response faltered completely under judicial scrutiny. Her claim that the meeting would have proceeded the exact same way regardless of my presence directly contradicted the language of the will, which defined participation as a strict legal requirement rather than a casual formality. Her lawyer's attempts to frame the protective clause as ambiguous were instantly dismissed when Mr. Vance pointed out that the provision had been reviewed and signed by 3 independent witnesses before my father's passing. The judge acknowledged this directly, noting that absolute clarity, not flexibility, had been the primary goal of the document. The final ruling itself was delivered without dramatics, but it was utterly devastating for them. The court affirmed the full, unquestionable validity of the will, including the protective clause. As a direct result, Elena was formally and permanently stripped of any unilateral authority to sell, transfer, liquidate, or manage the bakeries. Control over all executive decisions related to the $4.5 million business was reassigned entirely to me, according to the strict conditions my father had specified, effectively neutralizing every single action Elena had taken without proper consent. The court further stated that any future attempts by Elena or Mom to bypass these conditions would constitute a direct, punishable violation of the estate order. What surprised me most was not the legal outcome, but how incredibly final everything suddenly felt. The judge made it abundantly clear that this ruling resolved not only the ownership question, but also the legal boundaries between us moving forward. From that point on, all communication regarding the estate or the business payouts was to occur strictly through counsel. There would be no informal negotiations, no reinterpretation of roles, and absolutely no expectation of reconciliation imposed by the court. As the hearing concluded and the gavel fell, I felt a quiet, overwhelming sense of closure rather than a triumphant victory. The decision confirmed what I had understood for months, that my father had anticipated this exact conflict, and had chosen rigid structure over sentiment to protect what he built. Whatever family ties had once existed were now legally, permanently severed not through my anger or retaliation, but through a process that followed the exact rules my father trusted more than any promise made after he was gone. After the dust finally settled, the consequences became visible in ways no argument or screaming match could ever undo. What followed was not loud or dramatic, but it was absolutely permanent. Elena lost every single claim to control over the business once the court ruling took effect, including any authority to negotiate a sale or make operational decisions. The trust provisions were enforced exactly as written, which meant her access to the financial records ended immediately. She still receives a small, heavily restricted monthly stipend from the trust, but she can never touch the principal or the business itself. Mom also faced severe consequences she did not expect. Her deliberate attempt to support Elena against the legal will weakened her own standing within the structure my father had created, drastically limiting her financial involvement to what the document strictly allowed. The family relationship did not simply cool down, it formally fractured under legal boundaries that could not be crossed again. I stepped quietly into the role my father had prepared for me without announcing it to anyone on social media. The bakeries were not reclaimed through confrontation, but through process. I chose to oversee the transition carefully, appointing a professional management firm to handle the day-to-day operations while I retained final executive authority as outlined in the trust. Every single decision now follows written guidelines, documented approvals, and third-party oversight. There is absolutely no room left for personal pressure, guilt trips, or emotional appeals. The bakeries returned to being what they had always been meant to be, a stable, thriving operation, permanently protected from internal family conflict. We even introduced a new dark roast espresso blend named after Dad. It's our best seller. There was no magical reconciliation afterward. I did not meet with Elena again, nor did I ever respond to the pathetic, passive-aggressive messages sent through indirect channels by extended relatives. Communication stopped entirely, not out of petty anger, but because absolute clarity had finally replaced uncertainty. Mom attempted to reach out more than once during the holidays, though always with manipulative conditions attached. I declined each time. Silence became my fortress rather than a punishment, allowing massive distance to do what explanations never could. Life grew quieter in ways that felt deeply earned rather than empty. Without the constant, suffocating tension of contested decisions, my focus shifted to maintaining balance rather than constantly defending my position. The employees remained entirely unaffected by the dispute, their jobs secure, and the structure my father designed proved immensely stronger than personal conflict. What surprised me most was not the outcome itself, but how incredibly little I needed to say once everything was settled. This story is not about winning against your family, but about understanding your limits before conflict turns completely destructive. Clear legal preparation is not a lack of trust, it is a profound form of protection for everyone involved. Boundaries matter even more when emotions run high, especially within families where toxic assumptions constantly replace communication. Preparing for the worst does not mean expecting it. It means respecting reality enough to prevent absolute chaos when it arrives uninvited at your front door. Thank you for staying with this incredibly long story until the very end. Your time and attention mean more than you might realize, especially in stories that deal with such difficult, heartbreaking family choices. If this situation made you think about boundaries, inheritance, or preparation in your own life, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Different perspectives always help these conversations grow with honesty and respect. Top comments. User 1. The absolute sheer panic Elena must have felt when the lawyer asked why you weren't there, and she realized her own text message was the smoking gun. Chef's kiss. Your dad was an absolute genius. He knew exactly who his oldest daughter was, and he didn't just protect the business, he protected you. Good on you for having the absolute steel spine required to just sit on the couch and drink coffee while she destroyed her own life. User 2. I am a probate attorney and let me tell you, poison pill or in terrorem clauses are incredibly hard to enforce unless there is absolute, undeniable, documented proof of interference. The fact that your sister was arrogant enough to put it in writing don't show up is mind-blowing. She practically handed the entire $4.5 million estate over to you on a silver platter because she couldn't stand the idea of sharing power. Your mom enabling her is just the tragic cherry on top. Enjoy your peace and your bakeries. User 3. The audacity of them showing up at your porch the next morning talking about preserving family dignity after they spent weeks treating you like absolute garbage and trying to sell your dad's legacy to a faceless corporation. Narcissists always want to keep things in the family, the second the law gets involved because they know they can't manipulate a judge. You handled this flawlessly. Keep the silence going, it's driving them crazier than any screaming match ever could. My family kicked me out at 18, with $85. 10 years later, they demanded my apartment for my golden brother, so I sold their house and watched them lose everything. My parents secretly tried to forge a lease to steal my apartment for my golden child brother, then had the audacity to try and break in when I changed the locks. So, I dug into our family's legal history, uncovered a hidden trust they'd been leeching off of for over a decade, and completely legally forced the sale of the very house they were sleeping in. I remember the exact sound the deadbolt made when it clicked shut behind me. It was a heavy, metallic thud that echoed in the humid summer air. My dad had just shown up at my bedroom door, tossed a cheap, fraying duffel bag onto my mattress, and said, "Your brother starts his senior year of high school next month. He needs a bigger space to study, so we're giving him your room. You're legally an adult now, figure it out." I remember asking if this was some kind of sick, twisted joke. My voice cracked. I sounded like I was still 12 years old, not an 18-year-old who had just walked across a graduation stage 4 days prior, but my father didn't blink. He didn't show an ounce of hesitation or remorse. He just pointed a thick finger at the bag and told me I had exactly 15 minutes to pack my life away before he physically threw me out and changed the locks. That was how I left my childhood home. There was no graduation party, no tearful goodbye, no advice for the future. Just a heavy door slamming in my face, $85 in my wallet, and a sickening, hollow drop in my stomach as I realized I had absolutely nowhere to go. I wasn't a bad kid, I really wasn't. I never touched drugs, never snuck out, never got into a single fight at school. I worked a grueling part-time job stocking shelves at a local grocery store from 4 p.m. to midnight, maintained a 3.8 gigapascals, and quietly dreamed of saving enough to attend the local community college. But in my house, none of that mattered. I was the invisible spare. My younger brother, Liam, was the absolute golden child. Even when we were little, I used to joke to myself that our parents must have thought he was the second coming. If Liam got a B on a test, they bought him a new video game to encourage his potential. If I got an A, I was met with a distracted nod and a reminder to take out the trash. Liam would total his brand new car and get a replacement within the week. I would wear my sneakers until the soles literally detached, and I'd be yelled at for being irresponsible with my belongings. Liam was 2 years younger, but he was treated like a fragile, precious royal heir. He got expensive private tutors, weekend tennis lessons, and catered birthday parties. I got hand-me-down winter coats and absolute silence. Whenever I gathered the courage to ask my parents why the rules were so drastically different for us, my dad would just cross his arms, scowl, and bark, "Stop being so dramatic, Sam. The world isn't fair. Get used to it." I learned very early on that making noise only made things worse. So, I kept my head down. I worked my late-night shifts, did my homework by the light of a tiny desk lamp, and promised myself that the second I turned 18, I would pack my bags and leave on my own terms. I guess they just decided to beat me to the punch. That first month out on the streets was a waking nightmare. I couch surfed with a few sympathetic friends until their parents started giving me tight-lipped smiles and hinting that I had overstayed my welcome. There were nights when the rain was coming down so hard I couldn't see the streetlights, and I had to secretly sleep on a pile of broken cardboard boxes in the back storage room of the grocery store where I worked, terrified the manager would catch me. Eventually, I scraped together enough cash to rent a tiny, windowless room in a dilapidated shared house. I lived with 3 older guys. One of them blasted heavy metal at 4 a.m., another was running a very obvious illegal enterprise out of the kitchen, and the third was a quiet guy named Mateo who barely spoke English but would regularly leave hot plates of homemade empanadas outside my door when he knew I hadn't eaten in days. Mateo showed me more genuine warmth in a month than my parents had in 18 years. It took me 5 agonizing years to truly get on my feet. I worked every humiliating, exhausting job you can imagine. I scrubbed toilets at a dying mall, delivered pizzas in neighborhoods where my car was broken into twice, and worked overnight security at a warehouse where the heating was permanently broken. Every single break I had, I was glued to a battered, second-hand laptop, taking online courses and teaching myself coding and network security. I fought tooth and nail for every inch of progress, eventually earning a master's degree in cybersecurity. It wasn't a glamorous path, but it was mine. I built it with my own 2 hands. No trust fund, no safety net, no emergency phone calls to mom and dad. Just sheer, unadulterated stubbornness. By the time I turned 27, my life was unrecognizable. I was living in a beautiful, sunlit, 2-bedroom apartment in a highly sought-after neighborhood in downtown Seattle. I had a high-paying job as a senior security analyst for a tech firm, a reliable car, a solid group of friends, and most importantly, an overwhelming sense of peace. I never thought about my family. I had blocked their numbers years ago. I wasn't carrying around a burning rage anymore. I had just accepted that if I wasn't good enough for them back then, I certainly wasn't going to crawl back and beg for their affection now. And then, on a random, quiet Sunday morning, the ghost of my past came knocking. Literally. I was wearing sweatpants, holding a mug of fresh coffee, and getting ready to water my houseplants when I heard it. 3 sharp, aggressive, entitled knocks. It wasn't the polite tap of a neighbor or a delivery driver. It was a demand. And, I walked over, peered through the peephole, and felt all the blood drain from my face. My heart slammed against my ribs. Standing in my hallway was my mother. And looming right behind her, arms crossed in that exact same domineering posture I remembered from the day he threw me out, was my father. My brain short-circuited. My first thought wasn't, what are they doing here? It was, how the hell did they find my address? I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open, but I deliberately planted my feet in the doorway. I didn't step aside. Sam? My mother gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. She widened her eyes, trying to look breathless and overwhelmed, like this was some beautiful, cinematic family reunion. Oh my God, look at you. You look so grown. I am grown, I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of emotion. It's been almost 10 years. What do you want? My dad pushed his way forward, his jaw tight. No small talk. We need to have a serious conversation. Let us in. I stared at him. I looked at the gray in his hair, the familiar scowl lines around his mouth. For a long, tense 10 seconds, I didn't move. Finally, morbid curiosity won out. I stepped aside, leaving the door cracked open. They walked into my apartment and immediately began dissecting it with their eyes. My mother ran her fingers over the back of my expensive leather sofa like she was checking for dust. My dad paced near the floor-to-ceiling windows, taking in the view of the city skyline. The silence in the room was suffocating. We've had a really rough couple of years. And, my mother finally said, sitting down uninvited and clasping her hands tightly in her lap. And your brother? Well, Liam is in a really terrible bind. I felt a cold, familiar knot twist deep in my intestines. Of course this was about Liam. They hadn't tracked me down to apologize. They were here on a rescue mission for the golden child. What kind of bind? I asked, leaning against the kitchen island, refusing to sit down with them. He got let go from his startup, she said softly, adopting a tragic, mourning tone, and his fiancée. She left him. She took the dog, she took the car. He had to break his lease because he couldn't afford the rent. He's really struggling, Sam. His mental health is in the gutter. I just stared at her. I didn't offer a single word of sympathy, I just waited. My dad stepped in, clearing his throat loudly. We've been doing some digging, and we see that you're doing very well for yourself now. You've got this massive apartment, 2 bedrooms. We think it's time to put the past behind us and come together as a family. I raised a single eyebrow. Come together how, exactly? My mother gave me a pleading, teary-eyed look. We think the right thing to do would be for Liam to move into your 2nd bedroom. Just temporarily. Just for a year or 2, until he gets back on his feet and finds a new job. It would be so good for him to be around his successful older brother. There was a moment of absolute, ringing silence in my apartment. I genuinely thought I was hallucinating. A hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop it. You're joking, right? I said, my voice dropping an octave. No, my dad barked, his face flushing red. We are absolutely not joking. You have the space. You make good money. It is the bare minimum you can do. Family comes first, Sam. Those 3 words times family comes first times snapped something deep inside my brain. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it all washed over me like a physical wave of heat. Let me make sure I am understanding you correctly, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I pushed myself off the kitchen island and took a step toward them. You threw me onto the literal street on my 18th birthday with $85 to my name. You didn't care if I starved. You didn't care if I froze to death. You changed the locks on me so Liam could have a bigger study room. And now, 10 years later, you track me down to demand that I house the very same brother you ruined my life for, because family comes first? My mother looked down at her shoes, suddenly very interested in the rug. We made some mistakes, Sam. Parenting is hard. Mistakes? I interrupted, my voice finally rising. Forgetting to pick me up from soccer practice is a mistake. Throwing your child away like a bag of garbage is a choice. Listen to me, you ungrateful brat, my dad snarled, taking a threatening step toward me. He was trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, forgetting that I was no longer a scrawny teenager. I was taller than him now, and I didn't flinch. He is your flesh and blood. He needs help. You do not turn your back on family when they are bleeding. You did, I fired back, staring directly into his eyes. And I'm not doing this. Get out of my apartment. Now. The room went dead quiet. My dad glared at me, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to hit me, but he knew he couldn't get away with it anymore. He gave me a look of pure disgust, shook his head, and grabbed my mother's arm. You are going to regret this, he sneered as he yanked the front door open. You arrogant little prick. You're going to regret turning your back on us. They left, slamming the door so hard the framed pictures on my wall rattled. I locked the deadbolt, slid down to the floor, and sat there for an hour, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I thought it was over, I thought I had won by standing my ground. But I had completely underestimated the depths of their entitlement. The storm hadn't passed. It was just gathering strength. Update. 1. They didn't contact me for 5 days. I foolishly convinced myself that my dad's parting threat was just an empty bark. But by the following Friday, the psychological warfare officially began. It started with a voicemail from Liam. I hadn't heard my brother's voice in a decade. It sounded raspy, pathetic, and incredibly rehearsed, like he was reading off a script. Hey, Sam. Mom and Dad said they stopped by. Look, man. I'm at rock bottom. I'm sleeping on a buddy's couch and he's kicking me out on Monday. I have absolutely nothing left. I know we aren't close. But please. I just need a room. I'll clean, I'll cook, I'll stay out of your way. Please don't let me end up on the street, call me back. I didn't call him back. I felt a brief, terrifying flicker of guilt, but I crushed it instantly. I knew Liam's game. He had always survived by playing the helpless victim, wrapping people around his finger with a puppy dog routine until they fixed his messes for him. I wasn't going to be his safety net just because he finally had to face the consequences of his own incompetence. When I ignored the voicemail, my parents unleashed the flying monkeys. Suddenly, my phone was blowing up with texts and Facebook messages from extended family members I hadn't spoken to since middle school. Aunt Beatrice sent me a massive paragraph calling me a heartless, money-obsessed monster, who was letting his own blood rot in the gutter. A cousin I barely remembered texted me saying, wow. Didn't realize a little bit of tech money turned you into a complete sociopath. Help your brother, dude. My parents had clearly spun a masterclass narrative. In their version of the story, I was a wealthy, arrogant elite hoarding a luxury penthouse, while poor, innocent Liam was freezing in the slums. They conveniently left out the part where they made me homeless. At 18, I didn't bother defending myself, I just blocked every single number that came through. But then came the breaking point. I was sitting at my desk at work, deep in a code review, when my cell phone buzzed. It was my building's property manager, Mr. Henderson. I answered immediately, assuming there was a water leak or a package issue. Hey, Sam, Mr. Henderson said, sounding incredibly upbeat. Just calling to finalize the paperwork. I've got your brother Liam down in the leasing office right now. We're processing the lease transfer, but I just need your verbal confirmation before I run his background check to take over the unit on the 1st of the month. All the air rushed out of my lungs. The office around me started spinning. Mr. Henderson, I choked out, gripping the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. What are you talking about? I am absolutely not moving out. I never authorized a lease transfer. There was a long, horrifying pause on the other end of the line. Wait, what? Sam, your brother is sitting right in front of me. He has a signed authorization form with your signature on it. He said you got relocated to London for work and asked him to handle the unit handover. It's a forgery, I yelled, no longer caring that my coworkers were staring at me. Do not process a single piece of paper. Call building security and get him out of that office right now. I am leaving work and coming straight there. I hung up, grabbed my keys, and sprinted to my car. I broke at least 3 traffic laws getting back to my apartment building. When I pulled into the parking garage, I saw Liam standing on the sidewalk out front, holding a sleek designer backpack, looking annoyed. I slammed my car door and marched right up to him. "What the absolute fuck is wrong with you?" I screamed, getting right in his face. Liam actually had the nerve to roll his eyes and sigh, like times I times was the one inconveniencing times him. "Calm down, Sam, you're making a scene. You forged my signature on a legal document. You tried to steal my apartment behind my back." "I didn't forge anything, it's not a crime if we're family," Liam shot back, his voice whining with that familiar, sickening entitlement. "Mom and Dad said you were just being stubborn and needed a push. I figured if I got the paperwork started, you'd realize it's easier to just let me move in. I'm just trying to fix this family, and you're being a selfish prick." I was so blinded by rage I couldn't even form words. He honestly believed he was the victim. He believed that my life, my home, and my safety were his property to claim. "If you ever step foot near my building again," I whispered, my voice trembling with raw fury, "I will have you arrested for fraud. Get out of my sight." Liam scoffed, muttered something about me being a psycho, and walked away. I immediately went upstairs, called an emergency locksmith, and paid triple the standard rate to have a heavy-duty, high-security deadbolt installed. I also went on Amazon and ordered a discreet, motion-activated security camera, which I mounted directly above my door. 3 days later, I was out grocery shopping. My phone buzzed with a motion alert notification from the camera app. I opened it while standing in the produce aisle, and my blood ran ice cold. The live feed showed my father standing in the hallway outside my apartment. He was wearing a faded baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. He looked up and down the hallway to make sure it was empty. Then, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small tension wrench and a lockpick, and jammed them into my deadbolt. I stood there in the grocery store, paralyzed, watching my own father try to break into my home. He twisted the tools aggressively, his face contorted in frustration. He spent 3 full minutes trying to pick the lock before finally giving up, kicking the bottom of my door in a fit of rage, and storming off down the hallway. I abandoned my shopping cart and went out to my car. I locked the doors and just sat there. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I just felt a profound, terrifying numbness. There was a delayed reaction in my brain. It was the absolute, undeniable realization that my family didn't love me. They didn't even view me as a human being. I was an obstacle. I was a resource. And if I didn't comply, they were willing to commit felonies to destroy my sanctuary. I called out sick from work for the next 4 days. I didn't leave my apartment. I kept all the blinds drawn, ordered delivery, and jumped at every single noise in the hallway. I started sleeping with a heavy metal flashlight on my nightstand. The anxiety was eating me alive. I finally reached out to a therapist, Dr. Aris, via telehealth. During our second session, I broke down and told him everything. Dr. Aris didn't give me platitudes. He looked at me through the screen and said, "Sam, what you are experiencing is an extinction burst. When toxic people realize they can no longer control you, they escalate their behavior to dangerous levels to force compliance. You cannot reason with them. You can only protect yourself, legally and aggressively." That conversation changed something inside me. The fear evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculating, diamond-hard rage. I was done being the victim. I was done hiding in my own apartment. If they wanted a war, I was going to give them a nuclear fallout. Update 2. The final phase of their plan began 2 weeks later, and it was their fatal mistake. I received a thick, formal envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a 3-page handwritten letter from my mother. The tone was sickeningly sweet, filled with flowery apologies and nostalgic memories of my childhood. But the 3rd page held the poison pill. She wrote that Liam's depression had gotten so bad that he was having dark thoughts. She claimed that she and my dad wanted to help him start over by formally transferring the deed of the childhood home into Liam's name, so he could have a permanent asset to build his life upon. She casually mentioned that because of some archaic legal technicality from when my grandfather passed away, my name was still listed on the estate paperwork. She included a stack of legal documents with sticky notes pointing to signature lines, asking me to just sign these quickly so we can save your brother's life. I didn't sign anything. Instead, I immediately searched for the most ruthless estate litigation attorney in Seattle. I found a woman named Evelyn, whose online reviews described her as a legal shark who takes no prisoners. I booked a consultation and slid my mother's letter and the documents across her mahogany desk. Evelyn read through them in silence. When she looked up, her eyes were gleaming. "Sam," she said softly, "do you know what these documents actually are? A quitclaim deed?" I guessed. "Yes, but do you know why they need your signature?" Evelyn tapped the paper with her pen. "I pulled the public records on this property before you arrived. Your grandfather didn't leave the house to your parents. He placed the home in an irrevocable generation-skipping trust. Your parents are merely permitted to reside there. The actual beneficiaries of the trust, the legal owners of the equity, are you and Liam. Split exactly 50-50. I felt the room tilt. Wait. You're saying I own half of the house my parents are living in? Exactly. Evelyn smiled, a sharp, predatory grin. And the trust stipulates that the deed cannot be transferred, nor can the house be sold, without the unanimous, notarized consent of both beneficiaries. Your parents have been living rent-free in a house that belongs half to you. Now, they are trying to trick you into signing away hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity so they can hand it entirely to your brother. If you sign this, you forfeit everything. I sat back in my chair, my mind racing. The sheer scale of the betrayal was staggering. They weren't just trying to steal my apartment, they had been actively hiding a massive inheritance from me for a decade, and now they were trying to legally rob me blind. What are my options? I asked, my voice deadly calm. We can block the transfer instantly, Evelyn said. But if you want to push the issue, the trust allows either beneficiary to force a partition sale of the property if an agreement on usage cannot be reached. We can force them to sell the house, give you your 50%, and evict your parents in the process. I looked at Evelyn. I thought about the rain on my 18th birthday. I thought about my dad picking my lock. I thought about Liam trying to steal my lease. Do it, I said. But I don't want to just file the paperwork. I want them to feel it. We spent the next month quietly laying the trap. Evelyn filed a massive, airtight injunction with the county recorder's office, legally freezing the title of the house so no transfers could be made. We gathered every piece of evidence, the forged lease attempt, the security footage of the break-in, the manipulative emails, the trust documents. Meanwhile, I reached out to my cousin Chloe. Chloe was the only other black sheep of the family, having been disowned years ago for marrying a woman. We had reconnected briefly, and I trusted her. I told her everything. Chloe was disgusted, but more importantly, she was eager to help. She told me that the entire extended family was gathering at my parents' house that upcoming Saturday for a massive 25th birthday barbecue for Liam. My dad had been bragging on Facebook that he had a life-changing surprise for his golden boy. It was too perfect. I also made a phone call to a local investigative journalist who covered real estate fraud and elder abuse. I sent him redacted copies of the trust, the forged lease, and the security footage. He was salivating over the story. He promised me he would publish a massive exposé on inheritance hijacking, and agreed to time the publication perfectly with my signal. Saturday night arrived. I was sitting at my kitchen island in Seattle, my laptop open. Evelyn was on standby. The journalist was on standby. At exactly 7:15 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was a FaceTime call from Chloe. I answered it, muting my microphone. Chloe had her phone propped up against a centerpiece on the patio table, giving me a perfect, high-definition view of the backyard. The yard was decorated with expensive string lights and catered food. Liam was sitting at the head of the table, wearing a smug grin and a designer polo shirt. My parents were standing on either side of him. The entire extended family, including Aunt Beatrice and the cousins who had harassed me, were watching with rapt attention. My dad tapped his craft beer glass with a fork. The chatter died down. Family, my dad boomed, his voice echoing through the phone speaker. We all know Liam has had a tough year, but a family takes care of its own. Liam is the future of this family. And to make sure his future is secure, your mother and I have officially decided to sign the deed of this very house over to him. The paperwork is going through as we speak. To Liam, the new homeowner. The family erupted into cheers and applause. Liam stood up, looking incredibly arrogant, and hugged my dad. Thanks, Dad. It means everything to know I have parents who truly have my back. I smiled. It was the coldest, most genuine smile I had worn in years. I opened my group chat with Evelyn and the journalist. I typed one word, execute. 30 seconds later, the dominoes fell. Evelyn hit send on a massive, legally devastating cease and desist email, copying my dad, Liam, their cheap family lawyer, and every single extended family member whose email address Chloe had managed to scrape together. The email detailed the exact terms of the irrevocable trust, explicitly stating that the house belonged 50% to me, that the title was legally frozen, and that any attempt to transfer it was a criminal act of fraud. It also included a link to the security camera footage of my dad trying to pick my lock, citing it as a pattern of criminal harassment. 10 seconds after that, the journalist published his article online. The headline read, Golden Child, Stolen Trust. How one Seattle tech worker uncovered a decade-long inheritance fraud. The article heavily implied my parents' identities and laid out the entire sickening timeline, including the forged lease. I watched the FaceTime feed intently. My dad's phone buzzed. Then my mom's. Then Liam's. Then Aunt Beatrice's. Within 30 seconds, every single phone at that table was chiming simultaneously. My dad pulled his phone out of his pocket, annoyed at the interruption. I watched his eyes scan the screen. I watched the color completely drain from his face. He looked like he had just been shot. What is this? Aunt Beatrice gasped loudly, staring at her phone. David, is this true? Sam owns half this house? You tried to break into his apartment? The backyard descended into absolute, beautiful chaos. Liam snatched my dad's phone, read the email, and started screaming. What do you mean the title is frozen? You said you had his signature. You said the house was mine. My mother started hyperventilating, burying her face in her hands. My dad was stammering, trying to yell over the rising voices of the extended family, who were suddenly realizing that the heartless monster narrative they had been fed was a complete, fabricated lie. Chloe picked up her phone, flipped the camera to her face, gave me a massive, wicked wink, and ended the call. The fallout was biblical. My parents' cheap lawyer immediately dropped them the second he realized Evelyn had filed complaints with the state bar regarding his involvement in the fraudulent deed transfer. The extended family completely turned on my parents. Aunt Beatrice actually called me crying, apologizing profusely for the terrible things she had said, admitting my parents had lied to everyone about the trust. I politely told her I appreciated the apology, but I still didn't want a relationship with anyone who had been so quick to condemn me. 2 days later, I got a frantic, sobbing phone call from Liam. I let it go to voicemail. He left a 5-minute message begging me to drop the legal action, crying that our parents were going to be homeless, that he had already started buying furniture for the house on credit, and that I was destroying the family. I finally texted him back. Just one sentence, figure it out, you're legally an adult now. Evelyn was merciless. We forced the partition sale of the property. Because my parents couldn't afford to buy out my half of the equity, the house was listed on the market. They were legally forced to pack up all their belongings and vacate the premises within 60 days. The sheer poetry of them being evicted from the home they kicked me out of was a high I will never come down from. The house sold in a bidding war. After legal fees and taxes, my 50% share came out to exactly $215,000. That money is currently sitting in a high-yield investment account, securing my future for the rest of my life. Liam, completely broke and drowning in credit card debt, ended up having to move into a cramped, dingy studio apartment in a terrible part of town. My parents had to rent a small condo miles away from their comfortable suburban bubble. I never saw them again, but last week, I received one final piece of mail. It was a printed photograph of the empty childhood house, taken right before they handed over the keys. Scribbled on the back, in my father's aggressive handwriting, were the words, "I hope you are happy with what you've done to us." I took a magnet and pinned the photo right to the center of my stainless steel refrigerator in my beautiful, peaceful apartment. Every morning, when I make my coffee, I look at it, and I smile. Because yes, I am incredibly happy. Top comments. User 1. This is the most satisfying legal nuclear revenge I have ever read on this site. The fact that they tried to guilt trip you about family, while actively plotting to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from your grandfather's trust is genuinely sociopathic. Evelyn the lawyer deserves a massive fruit basket and a 5-star review. Enjoy that $215K, OP, you earned every single penny in blood and sweat. User 2. The absolute audacity of Liam trying to forge a lease transfer while you were at work. I literally gasped out loud. If Mr. Henderson hadn't been a thorough property manager and called you to confirm, you could have come home to your brother living in your space. Changing the locks and installing that camera saved your life. Extinction burst is the perfect term for what your dad did. Stay safe, OP. User 3. As someone who is also the family scapegoat, returning your dad's figure it out, you're an adult line to your brother via text is the ultimate mic drop. They relied on you staying the scared 1-8-year-old kid they threw out. They never expected you to grow up into someone with a spine of steel and a killer lawyer. So glad cousin Chloe got to be the embedded operative at the BBQ. Absolute cinema. You'd be homeless without us. Dad smirked while my brother stole my food. I said nothing, just moved out in secret, and exposed his illegal. You'd be homeless without us. My dad smirked after I caught them illegally opening my mail to demand more rent from my new salary. So, I secretly packed my bags, cut off the electricity, internet, and subscriptions I was funding, and left them in the dark to discover the massive financial fraud I was about to pin right back on him. Original post. My name is Marcus. I'm 28 years old, and I grew up in a household where love was always treated like a transactional commodity, and I was the only one paying full price. I am the oldest of 3 children, and from the moment I was old enough to hold a broom, I was treated less like a son and more like an indentured servant whose primary purpose was to subsidize the family's comfort. My parents, particularly my father, subscribed to a very specific, twisted philosophy. Respect is something you earn through blood and sweat, but absolute obedience is demanded by default. And if you happen to be the firstborn child, your obedience came with a heavy interest rate attached. You were expected to set the flawless example, maintain the fragile peace, and hold the entire household together, even when every other person in the house refused to lift a single finger. For the longest time, growing up, I genuinely believed this was just how the world worked. I thought all parents ruthlessly guilt-tripped their kids into scrubbing the floors and doing the heavy landscaping while slapping the label of teaching responsibility on it. I thought it was completely standard practice to be charged rent the second you turned 17 because, as my dad loved to repeat like a broken record, The real world doesn't hand out free rides. Here is the kicker: we weren't poor, we were actually far from it. My dad worked as a senior logistics manager for a major distribution company, bringing in a very comfortable salary. My mom worked as a freelance bookkeeper, entirely remote, setting her own hours. We lived in a sprawling 4-bedroom house in a nice suburban neighborhood. We had a massive, manicured backyard, 2 late model SUVs in the driveway, and there was always plenty of cash flowing for lavish birthday parties, brand name clothes, and expensive dinners out at steakhouses. But my parents harbored this bizarre obsession with hardening us for the cruel realities of the world, only that so-called hardening was exclusively directed at me. My younger siblings lived in an entirely different universe. My brother Liam, who is 2 years younger than me, could literally crash his car into a neighbor's brick mailbox while texting, and somehow my parents would spin the narrative to make him the tragic victim of a poorly placed structure. My sister Chloe, who is currently 19 and a freshman in college, had a bedroom that looked like an Apple Store showroom. She had gadgets and electronics I couldn't even dream of affording when I was her age. Meanwhile, I had to wage absolute war just to get a Wi-Fi extender that reached my bedroom in the unfinished basement, a damp, concrete-walled dungeon for which I was charged exactly $500 a month in rent. I started working the moment it was legally permissible. At 15, I got a grueling part-time job at a massive supermarket chain, spending hours on my feet bagging groceries, retrieving carts in the freezing snow, and scrubbing massive spills in the aisles. Eventually, I transitioned to a warehouse job, loading heavy pallets on the night shift while trying to drag myself through the final years of high school. My parents made their stance crystal clear: if I wanted a vehicle, gas money, car insurance, or literally anything beyond the absolute bare minimum of tap water and basic shelter, it was entirely on my shoulders. When I finally got my driver's license, I drained my meager savings account to purchase a rusted-out, dented 2004 Honda Civic that rattled violently if you pushed it past 60 miles an hour. When I pulled that awful car into the driveway for the first time, my dad stood on the porch, crossed his arms, smirked, and said, "Looks like you're finally learning how the real world works, Marcus." At the time, my desperate, validation-starved teenage brain thought he was expressing pride. But looking back with the clarity of adulthood, I realize he just thoroughly enjoyed the spectacle of my struggle. It reinforced his rigid belief system that the world was a brutal meat grinder and that kids needed to be shoved into it early. After I graduated high school, the concept of going straight to a 4-year university was completely off the table. I simply didn't have the funds, and my parents weren't offering a single dime of assistance. If you want a fancy college degree, my dad lectured me over dinner one night, you go out and get a job that pays for tuition. Or you take out loans and drown in them like everyone else. But you are absolutely not living in this house for free while you figure yourself out playing beer pong. So, I didn't go to college. Instead, I worked a soul-crushing rotation of warehouse shifts, late-night delivery gigs, and weekend retail jobs, doing absolutely anything I could to keep handing over my $500 rent every first of the month while painfully scraping together a small savings cushion. During the exhausting hours between shifts, I started aggressively pursuing IT certifications online. I taught myself advanced networking, server administration, cloud architecture, and the complex basics of enterprise cybersecurity. It was a brutal, sleep-deprived existence, especially while working 40 to 50 hours a week of physical labor, but I gritted my teeth and made it happen. By the time I turned 25, my relentless grinding finally paid off. I landed a fantastic full-time, fully remote position doing high-level tech support and network infrastructure management for a rapidly growing mid-size logistics software firm. It wasn't quite a 6-figure salary yet, but it was incredibly stable, came with full benefits, and most importantly, it was an achievement that belonged entirely to me. I finally had a tiny sliver of breathing room in my life. I was still living in the damp basement, still handing over my rent money with absolute precision, and still enduring a barrage of passive-aggressive commentary every time I had to skip a Sunday family dinner because I was stuck on an emergency server maintenance call. But the sheer panic of poverty was gone. I actually started browsing apartment listings, dreaming of getting my own quiet place, maybe even enrolling in night classes to finally get that bachelor's degree. And then, the global pandemic turned the world upside down. Almost overnight, the entire dynamic of the house shifted. Liam, who had been lazily working as a bartender downtown, lost his job when the restaurants shut down. He immediately packed up his apartment and moved back into his old, spacious upstairs bedroom. Naturally, my parents, who had spent my entire life insisting I pay rent because the universe owes nobody a living, suddenly decided that Liam didn't need to contribute a single cent. "He's going through an incredibly stressful transition right now," my mom cooed softly, patting his shoulder. "This is a global crisis. It's simply not the time to add financial pressure to his plate." Meanwhile, Chloe, whose college campus had closed, moved back home to take her classes online. She completely inverted her schedule, Sleeping until 2 in the afternoon and then blasting obnoxious TikToks and reality TV shows at maximum volume through the thin floorboards directly above my basement workspace well into the early hours of the morning. Through all of this chaos, I kept my head down. I kept working my demanding remote job, kept paying my $500 rent without fail, kept buying the bulk of the household groceries, and kept getting ruthlessly guilt-tripped every time I politely asked for 10 minutes of quiet so I could lead a crucial Zoom meeting with my company's executives. It genuinely felt like I was a paying guest in a terrible hotel that I was secretly funding out of my own pocket, except the management actively despised me and the other guests were receiving complimentary room service. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Liam started making snide, degrading comments about my profession. Must be real nice to just sit around in your pajamas all day. He'd sneer from the kitchen island, casually sipping the expensive cold brew coffee I had purchased with my own money. Or he'd say, "Some of us actually do real, physical labor, Marcus. We don't just sit in a dark basement clicking a mouse and pretending it's hard work." My dad would chuckle from his recliner, treating Liam's blatant disrespect like it was a hilarious inside joke. "Your brother isn't entirely wrong, Marcus," my dad chimed in one evening. "If the power grid fails, what exactly are you going to do? You're not exactly an essential worker, are you?" I wanted to scream until my lungs gave out. I wanted to violently list off every single bill I was covering, every grocery run I made, every time I fixed their broken laptops and shattered phones. Instead, I just bit my tongue, nodded blankly, and retreated to my basement. The absolute breaking point happened on a humid Tuesday night. I had just finished a grueling 12-hour shift. The company's primary servers had crashed, we were fighting off a sophisticated phishing attack, and 3 of my key team members were out sick. My brain felt like it had been put through a blender. All I wanted in the entire world was to go upstairs, make the elaborate chicken and rice meal I had specifically prepped the night before, and stare blankly at a screen until I fell asleep. But when I trudged up the stairs and opened the refrigerator, my jaw dropped. Half of the groceries I had purchased just 2 days prior were completely gone. My expensive protein shakes, my carefully portioned chicken breasts, my specialized pre-workout meals, all of it had vanished. I slowly turned around and looked into the living room. There was Liam, sprawled across the sofa, shirtless, mindlessly playing a video game, and loudly burping up the distinct smell of my garlic herb chicken. "You're welcome," he muttered, not even bothering to take his eyes off the television screen. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my heart rate from exploding. I walked over and asked him, very calmly, why he continually felt entitled to take my expensive groceries when he didn't contribute a single dollar to the household expenses. He just paused his game, leaned back, and laughed directly in my face. "Bro, chill out. What's mine is yours, right? That's what family is for. Stop being such a tightwad." I brought the issue up to my parents that night at the dinner table. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't throwing accusations. I simply asked, in a measured tone, if we could establish some basic boundaries in the house. I suggested we could label our food, or maybe set up a shared grocery budget, just something to maintain order. That was when my dad slammed his heavy fist down on the wooden dining table so hard the silverware rattled. "You are acting like a damn ungrateful guest in your own home," he snapped, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. "You think you're somehow better than your brother just because you managed to get some cushy desk job and print out a little IT certificate. Let me remind you of reality, Marcus. You would be completely homeless without us. You live in this house because your mother and I generously allow you to, don't you ever forget that." I looked at him. I looked at my mother, who was silently staring at her plate, refusing to intervene. I looked at Liam, who was failing to hide a smug grin. I didn't say a single word. Not then. I just calmly stood up from my chair, walked down the stairs to the basement, closed my door, and sat on the edge of my mattress for a very, very long time. Something deep inside my chest shifted that night. It felt entirely different from all the previous arguments. It wasn't the first time my dad had pulled the "you'd be homeless" card to assert his dominance, but for some reason, this time, the words didn't sting. They didn't make me feel small or inadequate. They didn't feel like a reflection of my supposed failures. It just felt like crystal clear clarity. That was the exact moment I fully accepted that I was not going to stay in this house much longer. But I also made a silent vow to myself, if I was going to leave, I absolutely was not going to fade away quietly. And I was definitely not going to continue secretly funding their comfortable, oblivious lives while they treated me like a piece of garbage stuck to the bottom of their shoes. Update 1. The meticulous planning began the very next morning. I didn't just pack a duffel bag and storm out in a fit of rage. That would have been too easy for them to dismiss as a childish tantrum. I needed a flawless execution. When I sat at my desk and genuinely began to audit my life, the sheer scale of my financial entanglement with my family made my stomach churn. My name was attached to significantly more things than I cared to admit. The high-speed fiber internet that the whole family relied on? Solely under my name and my credit card. The monthly electricity and gas bills? Technically split in the online portal, But my card was the only one set to auto-pay, meaning I had been covering the entire house's massive energy consumption for the last 3 years. The entire suite of streaming services, Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, Spotify Premium, Amazon Prime, all registered to my email, all charged to my accounts. At some point, without any formal discussion, I had quietly morphed into the foundational load-bearing pillar of the household's entire logistical and financial structure. And the wildest part was that they genuinely believed they were the ones supporting me. The sheer audacity of their delusion was put on full display later that week. I woke up to my sister Chloe stomping aggressively around the upstairs hallway. Apparently, she couldn't find her expensive AirPods. Before I could even pour my morning coffee, she barged to the top of the basement stairs and launched into a full-blown interrogation. "Did you steal them?" she demanded, crossing her arms and glaring down at me like I was a convicted thief. "Why would I steal your headphones, Chloe? I have my own," I replied, utterly exhausted. "Because I borrowed your Bluetooth speaker last month and accidentally broke it, and you got mad. So, obviously you took my AirPods as revenge." I just stared at her. That was the level of logic I was dealing with. She had wronged me, so in her mind, I was the villain plotting petty retaliation. I shook my head, told her to ask Liam, and walked away. Later that same afternoon, my phone buzzed. It was a Venmo request from my mother. The amount was $55.20, accompanied by a cold little note, household groceries and cleaning supplies. There was no prior discussion, no context, just a digital demand for my money. The absolute best part of this ridiculous request? I had literally done a massive grocery run 3 days prior, spending $95 of my own hard-earned money on essentials, eggs, milk, chicken, toilet paper, laundry detergent, stuff that absolutely nobody thanked me for, and stuff I watched evaporate into Liam's stomach in record time. I hit the decline button without a second thought. 30 minutes later, my phone lit up with a text message. "Mom, did you decline the payment request on purpose?" "Oh. Me. Yes. Mom, that is incredibly selfish, Marcus. We are a family. We all have to contribute to this household." "Me, I do contribute. I just bought $95 worth of groceries on Monday." "Mom, that was your personal choice. This request is for the shared items I purchased. You need to pay your fair share." "Me, I didn't ask for any of those items, and no one ever offers to split the cost of the food I buy that Liam eats. I'm not paying it." She didn't respond to the text, but the energy at the dinner table that evening was absolutely toxic. The air was thick and freezing cold. My mother completely refused to look in my direction. My father kept aggressively clearing his throat every few minutes, his jaw clenched tight, practically vibrating with the urge to scream at me but trying to maintain his intimidating silence. Chloe was entirely ignoring the tension, snapping photos of her mashed potatoes to post on Instagram, curating her fake aesthetic life. Then Liam, ever the instigator, decided to play his favorite role of provocateur. "So," he said casually, aggressively stabbing a piece of chicken with his fork, "I heard you're refusing to pay Mom back for the groceries." I kept my eyes on my plate and didn't answer. "Kind of a pathetic, low blow considering she literally gave birth to you and raised you," Liam pushed, grinning over his water glass. I remained completely silent, chewing my food methodically. "Marcus," my dad barked, his voice slicing through the room like a whip, "answer your brother when he speaks to you." "I am not answering anyone at this table. This is a dinner, not a legal deposition," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "You are sitting under our roof." My dad exploded, slamming his hand on the table again. "When we ask you a question, you answer it." I slowly wiped my mouth with a napkin, stood up from the table, and looked him dead in the eyes. "Then maybe I won't be sitting under your roof much longer." My mom finally broke her silence, letting out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Oh, please, where exactly are you going to go, Marcus? You think you're actually ready to survive out in the real world on your own? Everything you have right now is because of us." Because of us. Those 3 words echoed in my skull. They genuinely believed that my grueling IT job, my late-night study sessions, my carefully guarded savings account, none of it was my own merit. In their twisted reality, I was just a charity case who had been handed a scholarship to life, and they were the benevolent, long-suffering donors. I didn't utter another syllable. I turned my back on them and walked down into the basement. That night, I pulled up my financial spreadsheets and got to work. I analyzed my bank accounts, calculated exactly what it would take to secure a decent apartment, and started rapidly browsing rental listings on the far opposite side of the city. I quietly called a few close friends, asking for recommendations on property management companies. I created a massive, comprehensive checklist: transfer the Wi-Fi, remove my credit cards from all household autopays, physically pack my electronics, secure a moving truck. I knew it would take a solid 2 weeks to meticulously untangle my digital and financial footprint from the house, but I was absolutely determined to execute it flawlessly. I wanted to leave cleanly, silently, without giving them the satisfaction of a screaming match, but making sure the bridge was thoroughly incinerated behind me. Over the next week, I began the invisible extraction process. I contacted the fiber internet provider, informed them I was relocating, and scheduled a hard cutoff date for the service, 2 weeks from that Monday. Perfect. I logged into the electricity and gas portals, fully removed my primary credit card information, deleted my user profile, and let the accounts default back to the physical property address. My dad would eventually receive a massive paper bill in the mail. He could figure it out. Meanwhile, life upstairs carried on in blissful, ignorant entitlement. Liam continued to raid my remaining groceries. Chloe permanently borrowed my backup power banks. My mom sent me yet another Venmo request, this time for $28.50 for cleaning supplies. I let it sit in the pending folder, entirely ignored. Then came the catastrophic boiling point. It was a Thursday evening. I had been trapped in back-to-back virtual meetings since 8 a.m. When I finally emerged from the basement to grab a glass of water, I noticed something deeply unsettling. There was laughter coming from the kitchen. It wasn't normal laughter. It was that strange, conspiratorial, fake family joy that only ever surfaced when they were collectively gossiping about someone else's misery. My dad was sitting at the head of the island counter, grinning from ear to ear. Liam was leaning against the fridge, scrolling on his phone and chuckling. My mom wore a deeply smug, satisfied little smile, and Chloe was whispering excitedly. As I walked into the kitchen, the laughter abruptly stopped. And then I saw it. Laying flat on the marble counter was a crisp, white envelope. It was torn open. My name was printed clearly on the front window, right next to the official logo of my corporate employer. It was my quarterly bonus and updated salary pay stub. They had intercepted my mail, physically torn it open, and read it. I froze in my tracks. My chest tightened so violently I could barely draw breath. My heart started thudding with that heavy, sickening rhythm that hits when you realize your most sacred boundaries have been completely violated. Well, Marcus, my dad said, leaning back in his stool, his eyes gleaming with greedy satisfaction. You certainly didn't bother to tell us you were pulling in that kind of money now. I looked at him, then down at the brutally opened envelope, and then back at him. My mind was completely blank with fury. Seeing as your financial situation has vastly improved, my dad continued, crossing his arms, maybe it's time you start paying a much higher, fairer share of the rent around here. We're all struggling to keep this house afloat, you know. I slowly turned my gaze to my mother. You opened my private, federally protected mail. She had the absolute unmitigated audacity to simply shrug her shoulders. Oh, calm down. It came to our house address. It had our last name on it. We were just curious. Yeah, bro, relax, Liam chimed in, scoffing. It's not like we hacked into your bank account and stole the cash. Stop being so dramatic. You crossed a massive line, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, hard register. Oh, stop with the dramatic victim routine, my dad snapped, his faux-friendly demeanor instantly vanishing. We have housed you, fed you, and supported you for your entire life. You think you can just live under my roof and keep financial secrets from us now? I took a slow step backward. My fists were clenched so tightly my knuckles were bone white, but I wasn't shaking with rage. I was filled with something infinitely deeper, something intensely final. This was the point of no return. They had explicitly invaded my privacy, laughed at my professional success, and were now blatantly using it as ammunition to extort more money from me. That was the exact second the master plan fully solidified in my mind. I wasn't just going to leave. I was going to take every single ounce of comfort, convenience, and financial stability I had provided them, and I was going to rip it out from under their feet like a magician pulling a tablecloth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't engage in their pathetic argument. I simply relaxed my fists, gave a slow, deliberate nod, and said, okay. They all stopped and stared at me, visibly confused by my complete lack of resistance. What exactly does okay mean? My mom asked, her smug smile faltering slightly. It means you're absolutely right, I said softly, stepping backward toward the basement door. I shouldn't keep any more secrets from you. And then I turned around and walked down the stairs. What I didn't tell them in that moment was that I had already found a beautiful, quiet apartment. I didn't tell them that I had already signed the lease electronically earlier that morning. I didn't tell them that in exactly 3 days, I was moving out forever, and I was taking every single digital and financial thread I owned with me. When the utilities started bouncing, when the fridge ran empty, when their beloved Amazon Prime deliveries halted, they would realize exactly what my silence meant. But I wasn't done yet. Because there was one final, devastating piece of the puzzle I was going to uncover before I vanished. I didn't sleep a single wink that night. I lay flat on my back on my miserable basement mattress, fully clothed, staring blankly up at the exposed pipes on the ceiling. The dull, rhythmic hum of my server fan was the only sound keeping me company. My brain was trapped in an endless loop, replaying my dad's greedy smirk, Liam's mocking laugh, and the sight of my torn open mail sitting on the counter like a communal piece of trash. There was a crushing heaviness in my chest, not sadness, but an ancient, bone-deep exhaustion. I had spent nearly 3 decades shrinking myself to keep the peace, acting as the designated emotional sponge and financial safety net. They had relentlessly chipped away at my soul until there was barely anything left, and now, they wanted to consume the rest. I had exactly 3 days to execute the extraction. The apartment I had secured was a modest, second-floor one-bedroom unit on the far edge of the city. It wasn't a luxury penthouse, but it had large windows, pristine hardwood floors, and most importantly, an ironclad lock on the door that only I held the key to. No more damp concrete. No more passive-aggressive stomping on the ceiling. No more forced family dinners designed to tear me down. But I couldn't just casually pack my boxes and walk out the front door. If they sensed even a hint that I was escaping, they would actively sabotage the process. They would suddenly invent massive household emergencies. Marcus, the garage door is broken, you need to fix it before you go. Marcus, mom needs you to drive her across town. Marcus, Liam needs a loan. They would do everything in their power to stall me, drain me, and keep me trapped in my role as the useful idiot. So, I operated like a ghost. On Friday morning, while they were all asleep, I finalized the utility purge. I scheduled the high-speed fiber internet to completely terminate at exactly 8 a.m. on Monday. I permanently canceled the entire suite of streaming services Netflix, Hulu, Disney+, Spotify, HBO Max. I went into every single account settings page and clicked sign out of all devices. They wouldn't even realize what was happening until they tried to load a movie on Sunday night and hit a massive paywall. I completely revoked the autopay mandates on the home's electricity, water, and natural gas portals. I redirected my massive Amazon Prime account to default to a secure locker hub near my new apartment. I even contacted the post office and executed a strict change of address forward for all my mail, ensuring nothing would ever land in their greedy hands again. On Saturday, the physical extraction began. I packed my belongings methodically, moving in tiny, invisible increments. A few textbooks here, a stack of winter clothes there. My expensive external hard drive slipped into my laptop bag. I carefully disassembled my secondary monitors and boxed them up, leaving just the primary screen active so my desk still looked perfectly normal. Every time I smuggled a load of boxes out to my car, I parked 2 blocks away, sneaking through the neighborhood like a burglar escaping my own prison. And then, Sunday morning arrived. I woke up at 4:30 a.m., the house was dead silent. I carried the final, heavy loads up the stairs, my remaining clothes, my bathroom supplies, my kitchen prep containers. The very last item I grabbed from my basement desk was a small, cheap wooden photo frame. It held a picture of me from my high school graduation. In the photo, my smile was crooked and uncertain, and my parents were standing directly behind me, their heavy hands resting firmly on my shoulders. When I was younger, I thought that physical touch represented parental support. Looking at it now, in the cold light of dawn, I realized it looked exactly like they were physically holding me down, preventing me from moving forward. I took the photo out of the frame, tossed it into the metal trash bin, and left the empty frame face down on the desk. I walked out to my car, started the engine, and drove away. The drive to my new apartment took exactly 22 minutes. But those 22 minutes felt longer, heavier, and more profound than the entire 28 years of my life leading up to that moment. Every single stoplight I passed felt like a ticking countdown. Every turn of the steering wheel was a physical step away from the toxicity. When I finally unlocked the door to my new apartment and stepped inside, the air smelled like fresh white paint, lemon cleaner, and old pine wood. The large furniture I had ordered wasn't scheduled to arrive until Tuesday, so for the first 2 days, it was just me, a pile of cardboard boxes, and a premium air mattress I had purchased. But the silence. The silence was absolutely intoxicating. It wasn't the hostile, suffocating, minefield silence of my parents' house, where you were constantly waiting for the next screaming match to detonate. It was a thick, peaceful, golden silence. I could hear the faint, distant sound of city traffic. I could hear a dog barking happily in the courtyard below. I sat cross-legged on the bare hardwood floor for hours, my laptop open on my knees, just watching the afternoon sunlight slowly crawl across the living room wall. For the first time in my entire existence, I did not feel small. But the inevitable storm was brewing. Update 2. The chaos erupted precisely on Monday morning, right on schedule. They didn't fully realize I was completely gone until the essential services began collapsing around them. The barrage of text messages started hitting my phone at exactly 8:15 a.m. First, it was my mother. Mom, Marcus, the internet is completely down. Chloe needs to log into her college portal for a midterm. Can you restart the basement router? Mom, Marcus, are you awake? The power in the kitchen just flickered and now the fridge is beeping. Did you forget to pay the bill? The bill. Mom, We are literally sitting in the dark right now. Answer, your phone. I simply swiped the notifications away, sipping my hot coffee in my sunlit kitchen. Then, Liam's text started rolling in. Liam, bro, what the hell did you do to the Wi-Fi? I'm in the middle of a ranked match. Liam, hello, are you even downstairs? Mom is freaking out. Liam, did you seriously change the Netflix password? You're being incredibly petty. Still, I maintained absolute radio silence. By Tuesday afternoon, the panic had fully set in. I woke up to 14 missed calls and a massive, rambling voicemail from my dad. When I pressed play, his voice sounded entirely different. The arrogant, booming authority he constantly wielded was completely stripped away, replaced by a frantic, breathless uncertainty. Marcus, listen to me. We need to talk immediately. Things have gotten incredibly complicated here. The utility companies are saying the accounts were closed. There's been some sort of massive misunderstanding. You cannot just cut off the entire house like this. That is not how a family operates. Call me back the second you get this message. I sat at my new desk and let out a dark, hollow laugh. That is not how a family operates. It was the ultimate, sickening irony. They had been operating exactly like that toward me for my entire life, using me, draining me, treating me like a disposable resource, and the absolute second I mirrored their energy and cut off their supply, it was suddenly a catastrophic crime against the concept of family. 2 full weeks passed. I completely ignored their endless barrage of calls, texts, and manipulative emails. I focused entirely on my new life. I decorated my apartment. I bought a real, comfortable bed. I poured my energy into my IT job, optimizing server architectures and closing out support tickets with record speed. My department manager actually scheduled a one-on-one call just to tell me he was incredibly impressed with the sudden surge in my productivity and offered me a spot on the senior infrastructure team, which came with a massive 20% pay bump. I was thriving. The miserable, battered version of Marcus who lived in a damp basement and begged for scraps of parental affection was dead. But just when I thought I had smoothly sailed into the sunset, the universe decided to drop a nuclear bomb in my lap. It happened on a quiet Thursday night. I was casually migrating some of my old digital files from my personal cloud storage to a new encrypted drive. Out of pure, idle curiosity, I logged into a very old, secondary email account I hadn't actively used in nearly 3 years, the one I used to use for junk mail and old college applications. As the inbox slowly populated, my eyes locked onto an email thread sitting near the top, flagged with a bright red urgency icon. It was from a company called Apex Financial Recovery. The subject line read, Final Notice, Intent to Litigate, Joint Account, ending in 4409. My blood turned to absolute ice. I didn't recognize the account number. I didn't recognize the collection agency. I aggressively clicked the email, my heart hammering against my ribs, and downloaded the attached PDF statement. There it was, printed in stark, black and white legal text. A massive, revolving home improvement line of credit. The total outstanding balance was a staggering $8,240.60. And right there, listed as the primary cosigner, was my full legal name, my date of birth, and my social security number. The secondary account holder was my father. I sat frozen in my ergonomic desk chair, the soft blue light of my dual monitors washing over my face as pure, unadulterated shock mutated into blinding rage. Suddenly, every single confusing piece of the puzzle violently snapped into place. I forced my brain to rewind 3 years. I was 25, working brutally long night shifts, utterly exhausted. My dad had casually approached me one morning in the kitchen, sliding a stack of dense, legal-looking paperwork across the island. He told me it was just a standard municipal form he needed my signature on to approve some minor exterior renovations to the house, claiming the city needed all adult residents to sign off. I was naive, sleep-deprived, and desperate to appease him, so I blindly scribbled my signature where he pointed. He hadn't been getting a permit. He had been secretly tying my pristine credit profile to a massive, high-interest line of credit. He had immediately maxed it out, likely to fund their lavish lifestyle, and had completely stopped making the minimum payments over 8 months ago. The collection agency had been aggressively emailing this old inbox because I had long since changed my primary contact info. This was the real reason he had completely lost his mind when I moved out. It wasn't about the $500 basement rent, it wasn't about the grocery money. It was about him losing physical access to the human meat shield he had illegally tied to his catastrophic financial mess. He had secretly built a massive debt bomb, strapped it to my back, and smiled in my face while doing it. I didn't scream. I didn't throw my keyboard. I didn't call him to weep and demand answers. The old Marcus would have done that. The new Marcus was a highly trained systems administrator who specialized in dissecting complex problems and aggressively neutralizing threats. I immediately went to work. Step 1. I pulled my comprehensive, 3-bureau credit report. There it was, a massive red stain dragging my excellent credit score down into the dirt. A severely delinquent $8,240.60 account. Step 2, I picked up my phone and called Maya, a friend from my old warehouse days who had since graduated law school and worked in consumer advocacy and financial litigation. I calmly explained the entire situation, sending her the PDFs over a secure link. Maya was silent for a long moment. "Marcus, this is textbook financial abuse," she said, her voice dead serious. "It happens constantly in toxic families. Is it technically illegal? It's a massive gray area because your physical signature is on the document, even if it was obtained under entirely false pretenses. But here is exactly what we are going to do. We are going to file a massive, aggressive fraud dispute with all 3 credit bureaus. We are going to place a hard security freeze on your entire identity. And we are going to force the original creditor to launch a full internal investigation into the origin of the debt." "Will that affect him?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. "Oh, absolutely," Maya replied, a hint of vicious satisfaction in her tone. "If you formally dispute your liability and flag the account as deceptive, the creditor will immediately shift the entire legal and financial burden squarely onto the secondary holder, your father. They will freeze his remaining assets, tank his personal credit score into the abyss, and come after him for the full balance immediately." "Good," I whispered. "Let's burn it down." I spent the next 48 hours compiling a devastating dossier of evidence. I gathered every single bank statement proving I had never received or benefited from a single dollar of that $8,000 credit line. I drafted a sworn, notarized affidavit legally, stating I was intentionally misled regarding the nature of the financial documents I signed. I submitted the massive packet to the credit bureaus and the collection agency via certified mail. But I realized I wasn't quite finished. If we were playing scorched earth, I was going to salt the fields. I logged into the tax preparation software I had used to generously help Liam file his taxes 2 years prior. My email was still the master recovery account. I could see that Liam had an unfiled draft return sitting in the system for the previous tax year. He hadn't reported his massive cash tips from his bartending job. He had been bragging about dodging taxes for months. I didn't hack his account, I just used the public, anonymous IRS tip line to submit a highly detailed report regarding a specific bartender failing to declare substantial cash income at his specific former place of employment. Let the federal government deal with the golden boy. Then, I meticulously scrubbed myself from every remaining emergency contact list, medical portal, and school registry tied to my family. I was a ghost. The inevitable physical confrontation finally occurred 2 weeks later. I was walking back to my apartment building on a Friday evening, carrying 2 heavy bags of groceries. As I approached the front steps, a silver SUV aggressively swerved to the curb. The door flew open, and my dad stepped out. He looked absolutely terrible. His face was pale, his eyes were bloodshot, and the arrogant, untouchable aura he usually projected was completely shattered. "Marcus," he barked, marching toward me, though his voice lacked its usual booming power. "We need to talk right now." I stopped on the concrete steps, placing my grocery bags down. I didn't flinch. I just stared at him with absolute, freezing indifference. "You think you can just play these sick little games?" he demanded, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "I just got a certified letter from the bank. They froze my checking account. They are demanding $8,000 in full. What the hell did you tell them?" "I told them the exact truth," I replied, my voice perfectly level. "I told them I was fraudulently misled into co-signing a massive credit line that I never benefited from." "We are your family," he screamed, his face turning purple, spit flying from his lips. "You don't sick the damn credit bureaus on your own father. I put a roof over your head. You wouldn't have survived without me." "No," I said, taking one deliberate step down the stairs, forcing him to physically step back. "You wouldn't have survived the last 3 years without times me. You used my name, my credit, and my paycheck to fund your pathetic, fake wealthy lifestyle, and when I finally stopped bleeding myself dry for you, you panicked." His jaw dropped. He literally had no response. For the first time in 28 years, the great, terrifying patriarch was completely speechless. "Do not ever come to my home again," I said softly. "If you do, I will call the police, and I will hand them the rest of the documentation I have regarding your financial activities." I picked up my groceries, walked up the stairs, went inside, and locked the heavy deadbolt. I didn't look back. A month later, the final verdict arrived in my mailbox. The credit bureaus had completely sided with my dispute. The fraudulent account was permanently wiped from my credit profile, my score skyrocketed back to the high 700 CES, and the entire $8,240.60 debt, along with massive penalty fees, was legally chained exclusively to my father's name. As a final act of closure, I logged into the old shared Google Drive folder that I used to manage for the family. I deleted every single photo, tax document, and recipe. I created one single, master folder and titled it Contributions. Inside, I uploaded hundreds of PDFs, every grocery receipt I had ever paid, every Venmo transfer I had sent, the $500 rent receipts, and finally, a screenshot of the official credit dispute resolution completely absolving me of his secret debt. I left a single text document in the folder. It read, "This is everything I sacrificed for this family. I used to think love was something I had to continuously purchase from you. I now realize you were just bankrupt, and I am done paying your debts. Do not ever contact me again." I removed myself as the owner, transferred access to his email, and permanently deleted the account from my devices. It has been a year and a half since that day. I am now a senior systems engineer. I bought a beautiful new car, no rust, no rattling. I spend my weekends hiking, traveling, and hosting game nights with friends who actually value my presence, not my wallet. Last week, a distant aunt accidentally forwarded me a digital photo. It was from Liam's recent, shockingly scaled down courthouse wedding. In the picture, my dad looked 10 years older, hollowed out and exhausted. My mom looked miserable. Liam and Chloe were staring at their phones. They were standing in the same frame, but they looked like four total strangers who had been forced into a room together. I looked at the photo for a long time. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel vindicated, I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. They had built their entire kingdom out of control, manipulation, and my stolen money. And the second I walked out the door and locked it behind me, the entire castle crumbled to dust. Top comments. User 1. The absolute audacity of your dad to pull the "you'd be homeless without us" card while literally using your stolen identity to artificially prop up his own fake lifestyle is genuinely sickening. You didn't just burn the bridge, you nuked it from orbit. Incredible execution on the credit dispute. User 2. IT guy here. The way you systematically shut down every single digital tether, the Wi-Fi, the Netflix, the Amazon Prime is pure poetry. They thought you were just a human ATM. Reporting the golden child brother to the IRS for tax evasion was the cherry on top of this beautiful revenge Sunday. Enjoy your peace. User 3. It is wild how toxic parents will absolutely drain their most responsible child dry, coddle the useless ones, and then act completely blindsided when the responsible one finally snaps and leaves. Good on you for protecting your credit and your future. Never look back. Don't destroy the family over a mistake, Dad said after my brother slept with my fiancée. I nodded, cut their funding, and let the law do the rest. Original post. I want to be unequivocally clear about something before I get into the weeds of this nightmare. I am not writing this because I need sympathy, and I am certainly not writing this to process my trauma. I am writing this because the full, unvarnished picture of what happened start to finish, every agonizing detail is the kind of thing that needs to exist somewhere outside of my own head. So, here it is. My real name doesn't matter, but you can call me Liam. What matters is that I built something real. I was 24 years old when I started my company. We specialize in cold chain medical logistics, automated temperature-controlled transport systems, secure routing for sensitive biologics, and operational consulting for pharmaceutical distribution. It is not glamorous. It is not the kind of thing you explain at a dinner party without watching someone's eyes glaze over into a comatose stare. But it is profitable in ways that most exciting industries could never even dream of. I had spent 3 grueling years after college working a soul-crushing warehouse job during the day, while doing inventory audits for a small medical supplier on nights and weekends. I saved exactly $6,000. I knew one guy with a regional pharmacy operation who needed better cold storage sourcing and couldn't afford a full vendor relationship. I became that vendor for him. Then I became that for 3 more like him. Then I hired someone. Then 2 more people. Then I stopped counting employees and started counting multi-state contracts. By the time I was 29, the business was pulling 7 figures annually. By 32, which is where this story truly begins, I had 22 full-time staff members, active contracts across 4 states, and a pristine reputation in a highly lucrative niche industry. I didn't take shortcuts. I didn't take venture capital investors who wanted board seats and control. I owned it completely, and I ran it the exact same way I built it, carefully, methodically, and without making unnecessary noise. The money changed things for my family. It happened gradually at first, and then all at once. My father, Arthur, had retired from municipal contracting the year I turned 27. He had done fine for himself over the decades, but retirement thinned their financial margins incredibly quickly. My mother, Helen, did part-time administrative work for a local real estate office. It was enough to keep her busy, but nowhere near enough to cover their actual living expenses. When my business started producing real, life-altering money, I didn't make a massive production out of helping them. I just quietly did it. Arthur needed a new truck because his transmission blew. I handled it. The roof and the kitchen in their aging house had been falling apart for a decade. I had them completely gutted and renovated. Small things at first, then much bigger ones. The biggest one was the house itself. It was a beautiful 5-bedroom colonial with a decent-sized yard in a neighborhood that had appreciated steadily over the years. I bought it outright in cash when I was 28. I put their names on the occupancy registry, but I held the deed. I covered the property taxes, the utilities, the HOA fees, and the maintenance without ever making it a monthly conversation. It was their home, I just happened to own the physical structure. That was simply how things worked in my head at the time. I was providing. Then, my older brother Marcus moved back into that house about 18 months before everything completely collapsed. Marcus is 38, 6 years older than me, and he possesses a unique, terrifying gift for being between opportunities in a way that always sounds temporary but never quite is. His previous venture had been some kind of crypto-adjacent startup that never gained an inch of traction. Before that, it was a drop-shipping franchise arrangement that spectacularly fell apart. He has charm. The specific kind of aggressive charm that works flawlessly on people who refuse to look at historical patterns. I looked at the pattern, I knew exactly who he was, and I helped him anyway because he was my brother and that felt like what a good son was supposed to do. I put Marcus on my company payroll as a compliance consultant. It was a low-level role, mostly vendor coordination, nothing that touched core corporate financials. It gave him an income that looked entirely legitimate on paper. In exchange, he had access to secondary vendor accounts and a company credit line meant strictly for minor operational purchases. I genuinely thought I was giving him a stable foothold to rebuild his life. I wasn't watching him closely enough to see what he was actually doing with that foothold. Then there was Elena. I met her at a corporate compliance seminar 3 years before all of this went down. She was working as a corporate auditor at the time. She was a phenomenally sharp dresser, impeccably good at reading rooms, and incredibly comfortable navigating conversations that other people found intimidating or difficult. We were in the same breakout session. She made a point about regulatory loopholes that I fundamentally disagreed with, and I told her so directly in front of the room. She laughed instead of getting defensive. I liked that immediately. We dated for 2 wonderful years before I proposed. She said yes without a single second of hesitation. I believed every single part of it. 8 months into our engagement, she abruptly left her auditing job and started describing her new work as independent consulting. The details were always incredibly vague whenever I asked. Client confidentiality, she would say. I'm still getting the LLC established, it's complicated. I let it go because my business was in a massive expansion phase, I was working 80-hour weeks, and I trusted her completely. That trust was a fatal error. The wedding was exactly 4 months out. The luxury venue was booked. The massive deposits were paid across the board. We had Sunday dinners at my parents' house every single week. Elena and my mother Helen got along famously. Marcus was always making the table laugh with his exaggerated stories. Arthur was always topping up everyone's wine glasses. Everything looked exactly like it was supposed to look. It was the perfect family portrait. I came home early on a random Tuesday afternoon. A massive client meeting had been abruptly cancelled, so I decided to take the rest of the day to decompress. Marcus's truck was parked in my driveway, which wasn't entirely unusual. He stopped by the house regularly to drop off paperwork or grab a beer. I didn't think anything of it. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, heard a specific kind of sound, and stood completely still in the foyer for a second while my brain desperately tried to catch up with what my ears were telling it. Then, I walked down the hardwood hallway toward the master bedroom. The door was open about 3 inches. I pushed it the rest of the way open and stood silently in the doorframe. I have replayed that exact moment in my head 1,000 times since it happened. What I saw in that room didn't break me. What actually broke me was what happened in the 2 hours immediately after. Specifically, what my own parents chose to say to me before I even had time to breathe through the shock. Elena saw me first. She went completely, terrifyingly still. It wasn't the stillness of genuine shock or panic, it was the stillness of rapid, cold calculation. Marcus turned over slowly, looking exactly like a man who had already started running the mathematical probabilities of his survival before he had even fully registered that I was standing there. Neither of them spoke a single word, neither did I. I stood in that doorframe for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. And then, I said quietly, without raising my voice even a fraction of a decibel, "Get out of my house." That was it. I turned around, walked into the kitchen, and sat down at the marble island. Marcus was dressed and sprinting out the front door in under 2 minutes. On his way through the kitchen, he actually slowed down, looked me dead in the eye, and said the most pathetic sentence I have ever heard. "Bro, it just happened." Like those 4 utterly meaningless words were going to magically fix the universe. I didn't look at him. I didn't respond. I kept my eyes locked on the countertop until I heard the front door slam shut and his truck engine roar to life in the driveway. Elena took a little longer. She eventually came to the kitchen doorway, fully dressed, her eyes artificially red, and said, "Liam, I can explain this." I looked up at her and said, "No, you really can't." She stood there for another agonizing 30 seconds, waiting for me to scream, to cry, to throw something, to say literally anything else. I didn't. So, she left. I sat at that kitchen island for 20 minutes without moving a single muscle. No music, no television, just the hollow sound of the house settling around me. I wasn't in shock, Exactly. It was more like the deeply unsettling feeling of a massive calculation finally completing in my head. It was like some buried part of my subconscious had suspected this answer for months and had just been violently handed the empirical confirmation. Then, my cell phone rang. It was my mother. That caller ID alone told me absolutely everything I needed to know about the very first phone call Marcus made from his truck as he peeled out of my driveway. He hadn't called her to cry or apologize. He had called her to get ahead of the narrative. And my mother, Helen, who had eaten dinner at my table every Sunday for years, who had hugged Elena and called her a daughter, opened the conversation with these exact words: "Liam, please. It was a mistake, he's your brother." I didn't reply. I pressed end and set the phone face down. Arthur called exactly 4 minutes later. My father's opening line was much more considered, like he had taken the time to think about the psychological framing. "Son, don't do something rash that destroys this family over one bad decision. Think about what we've built together." That word. Together. I sat in the deafening silence of my kitchen and let that word bounce around in my skull. What exactly had we built times together? The logistics business was entirely mine. Every contract negotiated, every employee hired, every agonizing decision made at 5 a.m. before anyone else in the world was awake, that was me. The house they lived in was mine. The truck parked in my father's garage was mine. The luxury kitchen my mother cooked in every Sunday had been completely gutted and rebuilt using my money. The steady stream of income that funded every single comfortable, insulated corner of all their lives came from exactly one source: me. And yet, the absolute second the people they had chosen to protect over me got violently exposed, suddenly it was a shared structure. Suddenly, there was a together that I apparently had a moral obligation to preserve. Update 1. I didn't sleep a single second that night. Elena came back around 10 p.m. I unlocked the door and let her in solely because I wanted to hear her talk. I wanted to see the exact mechanics of her lies. She gave a long, beautifully rehearsed explanation. She talked about the distance in our relationship due to my work hours. She talked about her profound loneliness. She claimed Marcus had aggressively pursued her. She swore it had only been going on for a few months and that it meant absolutely nothing. The words flowed out of her mouth in that specific, polished way that only happens when someone has been preparing a speech in their head for much longer than the crisis they are currently using it for. I listened to the entire monologue without interrupting once. Then, she said the one sentence that shifted the entire tectonic plate of my reality. "Liam, your parents knew things had been strained between us. I talked to your mother about it extensively. She understood." She said it like it was a softening detail, like it would somehow help her case. Helen had known Elena and Marcus had been spending significant time together alone. She had known the relationship was supposedly strained, and she had said absolutely nothing to me, not once. Not a single solitary word across dozens of Sunday dinners, casual weekly phone calls, and 100 different opportunities to say something. She had actively chosen to protect their disgusting arrangement over her own son. I didn't scream. I didn't react with anger. I just looked at Elena, and I smiled. It wasn't a sarcastic smile, and it certainly wasn't a warm one. It was just a quiet, deeply settled expression that apparently communicated something so dark she wasn't prepared for it, because she stopped speaking mid-sentence and didn't attempt to start again. She told a mutual friend months later that the smile I gave her that night scared her infinitely more than anything I could have ever shouted. I quietly asked her to leave. She practically ran out the door. I sat completely alone in the dark kitchen until 3 a.m. Then, I opened my laptop. I didn't open it to look at photos or wallow in misery. I opened it to start mapping every single account, asset, liability, access point, and operational dependency in my life. I wanted to see exactly who relied on what, who had access to what, and what the full, unvarnished financial architecture of my existence actually looked like when drawn out on a spreadsheet. Honestly, that was when I found the real betrayal. The cheating was just the appetizer. I found Marcus's name on a secondary vendor credit account that I had absolutely never authorized. He was listed as a secondary signatory on a digital document that bore my signature, except I had never signed it. I went through the last 16 months of financial records with forensic precision. The stolen amounts were small. The intervals were highly irregular. It was brilliantly intentional. It was designed to be small and irregular enough to stay completely below the automated fraud alert thresholds of our accounting software. Over the course of 16 months, Marcus had siphoned exactly $82,500 out of my company. And that was only what I had managed to find in the first hour of digging. By 5 a.m., I had 6 browser tabs open, 3 complex spreadsheets running, and a yellow legal pad completely covered in handwriting that had gotten progressively smaller and tighter as the hours dragged on. I wasn't panicking. That is the thing I really want to emphasize. There was zero panic in my body. What I felt was infinitely closer to the focused, airless, sociopathic calm that washes over you when an abstract emotional problem suddenly becomes a concrete mathematical equation. Abstract betrayal is devastating and messy. Specific stolen numbers are just a logistical problem to solve. I kept pulling the server records. Marcus's embezzlement method was surprisingly straightforward once I understood the underlying logic. He had legitimate vendor account access as part of his consulting role, which meant nobody in accounting ever flagged his logins. When legitimate invoices came in with minor, manufactured overpayments, the standard company practice was to apply that surplus as a rolling credit toward the next bulk order. What Marcus had been doing instead was manually redirecting those specific surpluses to a completely separate dummy shell account through a series of tiny corrective transfers. Individually, they looked like routine, boring reconciliation entries. Nobody reviews reconciliation entries at that microscopic granularity unless they are specifically hunting for a rat. I hadn't been hunting. By the time I mapped the full, exhaustive run of his theft, I stopped being surprised by what I was finding. Then, I seamlessly transitioned to Elena's layer of the nightmare. I pulled the master credit line authorizations first. I found a finalized document with my signature on it, explicitly approving a massive increase to the company's operational credit ceiling. I had absolutely never signed that document. I knew this with 100% certainty because that exact credit increase had been discussed internally with my finance team, and I had firmly decided against it 3 months prior. The discussion was logged in my email archives. The final decision not to proceed was clearly in writing. And yet, there was my signature on a formalized approval document dated 6 weeks after I had explicitly said no. Real, human signatures have natural variation. The pen pressure changes, the angle of the loops shifts slightly, the tail of a letter catches differently, depending on how fast your hand is moving. I had signed my name tens of thousands of times over the years, and no two signatures were ever microscopically identical. The signature on that credit document was technically proficient, but it was completely, mathematically consistent with another document I found. It looked exactly the way a signature looks when someone has obsessively practiced tracing it rather than actually living it. The second forged document I uncovered made my blood run entirely cold. It was a partial property asset transfer. It was preliminary legal paperwork that appeared to be slowly moving one of my most valuable business-held commercial properties into a jointly named marital trust structure. It had never fully completed processing. Whatever the intended endpoint was, the timeline had been interrupted by me coming home early. The signature on that transfer document perfectly matched the first forgery. Elena had spent years as a corporate compliance auditor. She was a master with complex documents. She understood exactly how financial paperwork moved through bureaucratic systems and exactly where the oversight gaps were. She hadn't been vague about her new consulting work because the work was boring. She had been vague because her actual full-time job was meticulously dismantling my assets to steal them. I sat back from the glowing laptop screen and stared at the horrifying mosaic I had just assembled. Marcus was aggressively stealing cash. Elena was quietly forging documents to steal real estate. Both of them were operating with enough brazen confidence and consistency to suggest they felt completely safe doing it. And then, I remembered the old family cloud server. I still had administrative access to a shared family Google Drive, a setup from years back that nobody had ever formally closed out or bothered to secure. I opened it, navigated to Helen's personal backup folder, and found an archived email thread from 8 months ago between my mother and Marcus. Helen's line, "Be careful, he'll notice eventually." Arthur's single-word reply from his linked account, "Agreed." Not, "Stop this immediately." Not, "What the hell are you doing to your brother?" Not, "I won't be a part of this." Just, "Be careful." My parents hadn't built the embezzlement structure. But they had absolutely known about it. They had sat down, weighed the moral cost of saying something against the financial cost of saying nothing, and actively chosen silence. Because saying something meant demanding accountability. And demanding accountability meant the immediate end of a luxurious, insulated life that I had been quietly funding for them for years. I closed the laptop at 6 a.m., and calmly brewed a pot of black coffee. While it dripped, I picked up my phone and called my overseas business attorney, a brilliant, ruthless man I had retained 2 years prior when I was exploring expansion into international export markets. He was someone completely outside of my family's knowledge or social orbit. I told him I needed to immediately begin restructuring the company's entire ownership architecture through the foreign registered holding entity we had previously discussed as a contingency during the export planning phase. He paused and asked me how quickly I needed it done. I told him I needed it done as fast as it could be executed without leaving a single legal vulnerability. He said 2 weeks, maybe less if we expedited the filing fees. Over the following 48 hours, I became a ghost operating in plain sight. I contacted a cutthroat real estate attorney and instructed them to immediately list the family home for sale. I priced it highly aggressively, competitive enough to move at lightning speed. The listing went up quietly. I systematically removed Marcus from every single company account, server, and physical access point, framing it internally to my IT department as a routine, randomized security audit, nothing that would raise immediate red flags with the wider staff. I moved every cent of my personal savings into a newly established offshore account that existed entirely outside of my family's awareness or domestic legal reach. I called the luxury wedding venue, coldly canceled the booking, and ensured the massive refund processed directly to my private card only. Then, I meticulously built the evidence file. Every single fraudulent transfer record, both forged signature documents, high-resolution screenshots of the damning email thread, and a clean, chronological timeline detailing exact amounts, dates, and IP addresses. I organized it into perfectly labeled digital folders, one for my investors, one for the extended family, one for Elena's professional network, and one for law enforcement. I saved everything to a heavily encrypted external drive. On the fourth day of my silent war, Elena came to my corporate office. She was incredibly composed. She had clearly taken the time to regroup and strategize. She walked in with the distinct energy of someone who had decided that a direct, reasonable adult conversation was the winning play. She sat across from my massive desk and talked about the lost wedding deposits, about how much social capital had already been committed, and about the tragic disruption to both of our lives. Then, she leaned forward slightly, lowered her voice to a soothing register, and said, "Liam, your parents think the best thing for everyone is to handle this privately. They suggested maybe we all attend family counseling, a structured healing process." She said it like it was a completely neutral suggestion, like she was merely relaying objective information rather than delivering a highly coordinated, manipulative message. But I had the Google Drive thread. I knew exactly how long this particular parasitic team had been in communication. I looked at her across my desk, and I smiled again. The exact same dead, hollow smile from the night she had left my house. She recognized it instantly. I watched her pupils dilate as she registered it, and I watched her brain desperately try to decide what it meant. She didn't reach a conclusion before I politely thanked her for coming in, stood up, and told her I would be in touch. She practically fled the office, looking infinitely more terrified than when she had arrived. That evening, I opened a secure travel app on a burner phone and booked 2 flights. The first flight was under my full legal name, heading to Chicago. The second flight was booked under my middle name, a name that appeared legally on my passport, but that I had absolutely never used professionally or personally in any context my family would ever recognize, heading to Charleston, South Carolina. Nobody knew about the second flight. Nobody knew about a lot of things. The final week was the most surreal, out-of-body experience of my life. I went to work every single day, answered routine emails, sat in complex client strategy calls, and handled all of them flawlessly. When Elena texted me asking if we could meet that weekend to talk properly and heal, I casually replied, "Sure, we'll sort something out." She sent back a deeply relieved-sounding response. She genuinely thought that meant progress. Marcus sent a massive, groveling apology text on Wednesday. It was 3 dense paragraphs, beautifully structured, and emotionally calibrated in a sophisticated way that absolutely did not match his usual illiterate writing style. Someone had clearly helped him draft it, almost certainly Helen. I read it once, archived it directly to the law enforcement evidence folder without replying, and went right back to what I was doing. What I was doing was finishing the execution. The offshore ownership restructure officially completed on day 9, significantly faster than the 2 weeks my attorney had originally estimated. My massive logistics company now sat legally insulated inside a foreign registered holding entity, with me listed merely as an appointed officer rather than the named domestic owner. Any future attempt by Elena to claim the business as a shared marital asset in civil litigation would now require navigating an international legal labyrinth that would take years and cost substantially more in legal fees than it could ever possibly produce. It wasn't entirely untouchable, but it was astronomically expensive enough to be functionally out of reach for people without vast resources. Which, as of that specific week, perfectly described every single person in my family. The real estate attorney called on day 10. We had an all-cash offer on the family home that was incredibly close to the asking price. I accepted it immediately. I demanded a standard contract with a brutal 30-day vacate clause for all current occupants, legally enforceable from the exact date of signing. Then began the quiet, systematic dismantling of their lives. I removed my parents from my Verizon family phone plan on a random Tuesday morning. I permanently closed the shared platinum credit card my mother had been using as her personal piggy bank for 2 years. I canceled the weekly HelloFresh grocery delivery account that billed to my card. I canceled the Netflix, Hulu, and Spotify subscriptions. I terminated the expensive insurance rider I had added to cover Arthur's truck. I canceled the HOA fee auto pay. I didn't announce a single piece of it. I didn't send a dramatic message explaining what was happening. These luxurious lifelines had simply been running effortlessly in the background because I had set them up and paid for them. Now, I stopped paying. They would discover each and every severed artery only when they tried to use it and failed. 3 days before I vanished, I called my operations manager, Sarah, my head of client accounts, and my lead logistics coordinator into my office separately and privately. I told each of them the absolute truth in strict professional terms. The company was undergoing a massive ownership restructure due to severe internal fraud. Their roles were fully secure, their salaries were guaranteed under the new structure, and all communications should route exclusively through the updated encrypted chain going forward. I gave each of them a massive retention bonus processed directly through the new foreign entities account. These 3 people I trusted with my life. I also knew that the 4 junior staff members Marcus had spent 2 years aggressively cultivating personal relationships with would likely read the sudden shift in the wind and make their own decisions to leave. That was perfectly fine. I had already accounted for their attrition in the new budget. The final family dinner was entirely my idea. I texted Helen on Thursday and said I wanted to come over for Sunday dinner, that I thought it was finally time to talk and heal. She responded in under a minute, overflowing with heart emojis. When I arrived at the house I legally owned, she had cooked a massive, elaborate feast, the kind of intensive meal that takes most of the afternoon to prepare. Arthur poured expensive scotch before I even sat down at the table. They were incredibly careful with me. Both of them hovered in that specific, delicate way people do when they think the victim is still deciding their fate, and they desperately need the decision to go their way. We talked about forgiveness, about perspective, and about how strong families absorb difficult things and come out the other side united. I asked leading questions that made them feel heard and validated. I ate every single bite of food on my plate. I smiled. At the very end of the evening, Arthur put his heavy hand on my shoulder, looked at me with faux paternal wisdom, and said, "We'll get through this as a family, son." I nodded slowly. I hugged them both. I walked out the door, got in my car, and drove home. Update 2. I loaded exactly 2 duffel bags into my car before 4 a.m. Everything that actually mattered had been quietly staged and shipped gradually over the previous 4 days. Legal documents, encrypted hard drives, and a few irreplaceable personal items that had zero monetary value but that I absolutely wasn't leaving behind. The rest of the house, the expensive furniture, the electronics, the art, I left exactly as it was. The dishes were clean in the sink, the lights were off, and absolutely nothing was staged to look like a permanent departure. I drove to the airport in the pitch dark and caught the first flight to Chicago under my legal name. I landed, waited 2 agonizing hours in the bustling terminal, and then boarded the second flight to Charleston under my middle name. I was heading to a colleague's private guest house, arranged entirely through a secure channel that had zero connection to anyone in my family's social or professional world. Nobody had that contact. Nobody knew that name was on a boarding pass. By the time the sun was fully up and shining over the Atlantic, I was completely gone. They figured it out in fragmented pieces, which I imagine was infinitely worse than finding out all at once. Elena arrived at my house mid-morning with coffee, intending to play the loving, repentant fiancé, and found the house locked, dark, and utterly silent. She called my cell number and immediately reached a dead voicemail on a line I had already flagged for permanent cancellation. Marcus got the legal vacate notice delivered via certified mail simultaneously with my parents. It wasn't a heartfelt letter. It was standard, brutal legal correspondence. No personal note, no explanation, just the cold, formal language of a finalized property sale and a strict 30-day eviction timeline. Panicking, he immediately called the corporate office. Sarah, my fiercely loyal operations manager, coldly informed him that his consulting arrangement had been terminated effective immediately due to the new ownership structure, and that he was legally barred from the premises. The 4 junior staff members who had been close to him had already handed in their resignations that very morning rather than navigate the terrifying new corporate chain, which meant he had absolutely zero allies left answering his frantic calls internally. The Verizon phone plan died sometime around noon. Helen tried to use the Platinum credit card at a luxury grocery store at 1 p.m., and it violently declined at the register. She tried to call my number 17 times over the course of the afternoon from a borrowed phone. Arthur's text messages started out measured and authoritative, and devolved into sheer, unadulterated panic by the evening. Elena sent a sobbing, hysterical voice message to the cancelled line that absolutely nobody would ever hear. And then, the massive debt collectors started calling. 2 separate vendors Marcus had been fraudulently deferring payments to under his falsified authorizations were now in aggressive, active collection. The operational credit line I had been quietly servicing through automatic payments went completely unmaintained the exact moment I severed my bank details. And commercial credit lines do not wait patiently. They escalate ruthlessly. By the end of the first week, the collection calls to Marcus were daily. By the end of the second week, they were constant, threatening, and legally binding. Arthur and Helen, who had absolutely never managed the massive financial obligations attached to a luxury property they technically didn't own, had zero framework for what was happening to them, or how to stop the bleeding. I know all of these details because my loyal friend Priya told me later, but that comes after I landed, settled into the beautiful Charleston guest arrangement, made a cup of coffee, and opened my laptop. The master evidence folder sat on my desktop clean, meticulously labeled, and organized into 4 distinct weapons: investors, extended family, professional network, law enforcement. I opened the law enforcement section first. My ruthless attorney had already drafted the formal criminal complaint. All I had to do was type 2 words to authorize him to file it. I read through the devastating document once, then replied to his email, "Do it." The formal criminal complaint hit the lead detective's desk on a Thursday morning. My attorney filed it with the full, unredacted evidence package attached: the fraudulent transfer records, the hidden reconciliation trail, the forged signature documents, the timeline, everything clean, chronological, and heavily annotated. When you hand financial fraud investigators a massive case that is already 90% built and gift-wrapped, they move with terrifying speed. By Friday afternoon, Marcus had received a terrifying phone call from a detective asking him to come down to the precinct for a conversation. By the following Monday, Elena had a certified letter from the exact same fraud department. I wasn't there to witness any of it. I heard about the panic firsthand, weeks later. At the time, all I knew was that the complaint had been officially filed, and that the brutal machinery of the justice system was now moving entirely on its own momentum. That was the whole point. I didn't need to stay and watch the explosion happen. I just needed to make sure the fuse was lit. The investor drops went out that same week. I had set up a secure Proton Mail alias months prior for dealing with paranoid overseas contacts. I used it now. Both of Elena's largest private investors received the exact same anonymous document, a 4-page forensic audit summary with the damning bank records attached. No emotional editorial, no narrative framing, just the cold, hard transfers, the shell account numbers, the dates, and the stolen amounts. It was clinical enough to look exactly like it had leaked from an internal corporate review rather than a personal vendetta. One investor forwarded it to his aggressive legal team within the same business day. The other called Sarah, who smoothly confirmed the company was undergoing restructuring and that an internal review had identified severe irregularities. That was all she legally had to say. It was more than enough. Their attorneys initiated a formal audit of Elena's consulting firm within the week. The extended family drop was infinitely more personal, and vastly more precise. I sent the forged signature documents and the embezzlement records directly to my Uncle David, my father's older, immensely wealthy brother. He was the kind of terrifying patriarch whose mere presence at any family gathering instantly dictated the tone for how everyone else behaved. He was respected in a way that Arthur had always quietly, bitterly deferred to. I also sent physical copies to 2 prominent cousins who had been at my engagement party, who had given tearful speeches, and who had looked me in the eye and told me they were so happy for me. I included a brief, polite note with each package. I have been advised by legal counsel to share this context with the family before the impending criminal proceedings become public record. I wasn't asking for their help. I wasn't framing it as a messy family dispute requiring their mediation. I was simply making absolutely sure that the people whose opinions carried the most weight in my parents' superficial world knew the full, unvarnished truth before the courts dragged it into the sunlight anyway. Uncle David stopped returning Arthur's desperate phone calls within 3 days. The cousins quietly, permanently withdrew from the massive family group chat. There were no screaming confrontations, no dramatic announcements, just absence. The specific kind of heavy, suffocating absence that arrives without any explanation and therefore cannot be argued with, bargained with, or managed. For Helen, who had spent decades meticulously maintaining the family's fragile social standing, that deafening silence was its own specific, agonizing punishment. The professional network drop on Elena was the quietest, and by far the most effective. Through a mutual, highly connected contact from my export expansion work, someone with zero personal connection to Elena, but a massive reach in corporate auditing and financial brokerage circles, I made absolutely sure her name was casually attached to the phrase criminal civil matter involving document forgery in all the right whispered conversations. I didn't need to distribute the documents myself. I didn't need to make unhinged phone calls. In elite professional networks built entirely on credentialed trust, dark implication moves 10 times faster than documentation. Within 2 weeks, massive corporate doors were slamming shut in her face in ways she couldn't possibly trace back to a single source. Then, Marcus and Elena did exactly what I had mathematically predicted they would do. They violently turned on each other to save themselves. The absolute second Marcus understood that Elena's forged signatures could legally position him as a co-conspirator in a massive real estate theft rather than just a separate embezzler, he started aggressively distancing himself from her immediately and publicly. He told mutual contacts she had operated entirely independently, that he hadn't known a single thing about the forged documents, that the financial side had been entirely his own isolated situation, and that the 2 crimes were completely unrelated. Elena found out he was throwing her under the bus within days. Her immediate response was to scorch the earth. She told a mutual friend, someone she desperately trusted, and absolutely shouldn't have, about all the fund redirections, about the hidden vendor account transfers, and about the horrifying fact that she had known for months and stayed quiet because she thought they were leaving together. She actually said that last part out loud. They were leaving together. As in, the master plan had been for both of them to completely drain my life, steal my commercial property, and exit with as much of my empire as they could carry. I heard this through Priya weeks later, and I sat on the porch looking at the ocean for a long time. By month 3, the entire structure of consequences was fully in place and running flawlessly without my involvement. The police investigation was highly active. Marcus and Elena were trapped in separate, terrifying legal situations that their mutual public contradictions were only making worse. The extended family social withdrawal had become permanent enough that Arthur and Helen had completely stopped expecting it to ever reverse. The aggressive debt collection calls were ongoing. The family home sale had closed, and the new buyers had enforced the eviction. My parents had been forced to desperately scramble and find a tiny, depressing 2-bedroom rental that Arthur's municipal pension could barely cover. I was working, traveling occasionally, and rebuilding the logistics company's structure into something infinitely cleaner, leaner, and more efficient than it had ever been before. Every single week felt more like my own life, and less like the chaotic aftermath of someone else's parasitic decisions. Then, 4 months after I vanished, I logged into an incredibly old email account. It was a college-era address, barely used, kept alive mostly out of digital inertia. I logged in solely to retrieve an old tax document I had stored there years ago. There were 14 unread messages. 13 of them were automated spam. The 14th was from Helen. The subject line read, "I know you won't read this." I almost closed the tab. My hand actually moved toward the trackpad to delete it. Then I stopped, took a breath, and opened it. She had written for a very long time. I read every single word, and at the very end, after everything she said, after the brutal acknowledgement, the deep shame, and the highly specific honesty I had never expected from her, there were 3 words. I sat with them for 20 minutes. Then I made the final decision left to make in this entire saga. The email was massive. Helen had never been a person who wrote at length. Her texts were usually brief, her communication strictly functional. This was entirely different. She had clearly written it over multiple agonizing sittings, maybe over multiple days, because the emotional tone shifted slightly in places the way writing does when the author comes back to it after crying themselves to sleep and sees it differently in the cold morning light. She didn't justify a single thing. That was the very first thing I noticed. There was absolutely no architecture of excuse underneath the words, no careful positioning of blame toward Marcus or Elena to soften her own horrific role in it. She bluntly admitted she had known about the money. Not the full $82,500, not every single transfer, but she had known Marcus was actively taking from the business. And she had calculated, her exact word, calculated that saying something to me would cost her more than staying quiet. She said she told herself it was a small thing, that he would eventually stop, that I was so rich I would never notice, or that if I did, it would quietly resolve itself without her ever having to be the one who said it out loud and ruin the peace. She actually quoted her own damning email back to herself. "Be careful. He'll notice eventually." She said she had read that line again recently and hadn't been able to explain to herself how she had become the kind of monster who could write it. Not times stop, not times this is evil. Just times be careful. Like the only real concern in her heart was the risk of the gravy train derailing, rather than the fact that her eldest son was robbing her youngest son blind. She said she knew Elena and Marcus had been sleeping together, and had actively told herself it was just a phase. That she hadn't wanted to see what she was clearly seeing because seeing it would require her to act. And acting would mean violently disrupting the only version of reality that worked for her. The version where I kept quietly building the empire, they kept endlessly benefiting from it, and nobody ever examined the rotten foundation too closely. She wrote, "We made you responsible for absolutely everything, and then we fully expected you to absorb the devastating cost of our moral failures too. That wasn't a family, Liam. That was dependency dressed up as love." I finally understood that the morning the sheriff handed us the vacate notice. I just didn't know how to say it until now. And then, at the very end, after all of that brutal confession, "Please come home." I sat with those 3 words for 20 minutes, not because I was actually deciding whether to go. I knew before I even finished reading the first paragraph that I was absolutely never going back. Not to that state, not to that broken dynamic, not to the pathetic version of myself that had kept the whole parasitic arrangement running just because it was easier than asking what I was actually getting in return. I sat with the words because they deserved that much respect. Because my mother had finally written something profoundly true and impossibly difficult, and I wasn't going to dismiss it without actually feeling the heavy weight of it. She was right about most of what she wrote. That was the honest, painful answer. The dependency dressed as love line was terrifyingly accurate in a way that took genuine psychological courage to put into words. I truly believed she meant it. I truly believed she was agonizingly ashamed. I believed that somewhere in the specific, humiliating collapse of the luxurious life they had built entirely around my labor, something had finally become crystal clear to her that comfort had kept blurry for years. None of that changed what going back would mean. I closed the email, I moved it to the trash. I emptied the folder. No reply. Not because I wanted her to suffer the silence maliciously, but because I had absolutely nothing left to say that the last 4 months hadn't already said infinitely more clearly than I ever could in writing. An answer would reopen a negotiation I had already permanently concluded. It would falsely suggest there was still a timeline where the outcome was different. There wasn't, and telling her that directly would have been its own specific kind of cruelty, more personal, more surgical than the silence. The silence, at least, left the shape of things slightly ambiguous. That was the absolute last kindness I had available to give her, so that was exactly where I left it. Marcus took a pathetic plea deal on the felony fraud charges 8 months after the investigation officially opened. The forensic evidence I provided was so overwhelmingly clean that his public defender aggressively advised against going to trial. He received a suspended sentence, mandatory repayment through a massive civil judgment that will garnish his wages forever, and 3 years of strict probation. The private investor lawsuit ran parallel to the criminal case and settled separately. What little assets he had left went entirely toward it. His name in every single professional context I had ever touched was permanently finished. Last I heard through Priya, he had fled to another state and was working a grueling overnight warehouse job. No startups, no consulting, absolutely no access to anyone else's accounts ever again. Elena's situation resolved through a brutal combination of a criminal plea and a massive civil liability finding. She fully cooperated with the investor audit in exchange for slightly reduced charges, which meant she handed over absolutely everything she knew about Marcus's transfers in addition to answering for her own sloppy forgeries. The legal restitution completely wiped out her life savings. The corporate compliance world had slammed its doors shut to her long before any of the legal outcomes were even finalized. Professional networks always move faster than courts. She is currently trying to rebuild somewhere else, in a completely different, lower-tier industry, suffocating under the weight of a financial and reputational reset that will take her decades to work through. Arthur and Helen are still living in that depressing 2-bedroom rental. The wealthy social world they had moved through so easily for decades has contracted in the quiet, permanent way that happens when people withdraw without announcement. Uncle David hasn't spoken to them since receiving the documents. The cousins are coldly polite at a distance when unavoidable family events require proximity, and completely absent otherwise. Helen has stopped being invited to the charity galas and luncheons she used to organize. None of that social exile was something I orchestrated directly. It was just the natural, inevitable result of a dark truth becoming known in a community where reputation had always been the only real currency. They have each other, and they have a specific, agonizingly private understanding of exactly which choices led them to a smaller, quieter, poorer life than the one they had grown so accustomed to. That heavy understanding is going to be sitting in the room with them for the rest of their lives. I am in Charleston now. I rented a beautiful apartment 2 blocks from the water. It is the nicest place I have ever lived in, not because it is massive or overly expensive, but because every single decision made inside its walls is entirely mine. Nobody else has a key. Nobody drops by uninvited to drink my beer. Nobody calls from the living room asking for money while I am trying to think. The logistics business runs flawlessly under the new offshore structure. The new operations director I hired has turned out to be vastly better at the day-to-day internal management than I ever was, which completely freed me up to focus on the high-level client relationships and expansion strategy I had been neglecting for years while I was too busy being everyone's personal financial infrastructure. I am 32. I work hard. I travel when the work calls for it. I am not in any rush to rebuild anything personal, not because I am irreparably damaged or closed off, but because for the absolute first time in a very long time, I am not operating from a massive emotional deficit. I am not giving more of myself than I have. I am not exhausting myself maintaining a fake version of reality that requires me to actively look away from what I am actually seeing. Priya texts occasionally. Nothing heavy, just the normal, casual back and forth of two people who have firmly established that they are on the same side of reality. That is more than enough for me right now. I thought, when I was sitting at that marble kitchen island at 3 a.m. running the financial map, that what I was building toward was revenge. I thought I wanted some deeply satisfying, explosive final act of destruction that would feel like cinematic justice when it finally landed. What it actually felt like was simply removal. I stepped out from under a massive, rotting structure I had been exhausting myself holding up for years. And the structure violently collapsed not because I actively demolished it with a sledgehammer, but because it had absolutely never been capable of standing on its own 2 feet. The collapse wasn't something I maliciously did to them. It was just the reality of what was always true, finally allowed to be visible to the world. Elena once told me my silence scared her infinitely more than anything I could have ever said. My mother's final email was the absolute last test of that theory. I deleted it, closed the laptop, made a cup of black coffee, stood at the massive window while it brewed, and watched the street outside doing its perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning things. A woman walking a golden retriever, a delivery truck idling at the corner, seagulls on a wire doing absolutely nothing in particular. Completely, beautifully ordinary. That was exactly the point. Top comments. User 1. The line dependency dressed up as love is one of the most chillingly accurate descriptions of toxic family dynamics I've ever read. Your mom didn't love you, Liam. She loved what you provided. The fact that she was willing to let your brother steal from you just so she wouldn't have to deal with the drama of confronting him tells you everything. You didn't ruin them. You just stopped being their shield. Good on you for getting out clean. User 2. I am a forensic accountant, and the way you handled that audit and the legal restructuring is pure, unadulterated poetry. Moving the assets to a foreign holding entity before dropping the hammer was a masterstroke. Elena thought her compliance background made her smart, but she forgot the golden rule: never try to outpaper the guy who built the company from the ground up. Enjoy Charleston, you earned every bit of that piece. User 3. The fact that Marcus tried to throw Elena under the bus the second the heat came down, and she immediately retaliated by admitting they were going to drain you and run away together. Absolute chef's kiss. Thieves have no loyalty. It's wild how quickly a family crumbles when the person funding the delusion finally walks away. The silence was the ultimate revenge.